It's 2014 and Halloween night in Palo Alto, California. Alan Beam weaves through a crush of bodies at a dive bar. The room smells like spilled beer and sweat, and all around Beam, people in costumes down their drinks and shout over the music. It's a surreal evening. Beam is surrounded by superheroes and skeletons. A witch shoots pool with a stormtrooper. Everyone seems happy and carefree, except Beam. Beam is the laboratory director for Theranos, a health technology company and one of Silicon Valley's hottest startups. Beam's responsibilities at work are endless, and so are the hours. And while he's dressed like a zombie for Halloween, he feels like one too. But it's not just the crushing deadlines and intense pressure. Beam recently learned a devastating secret, and if it gets out, he and many people he works with could be ruined. So tonight, Beam isn't in the mood to laugh and talk with adults dressed as vampires. He needs to put in just a few minutes chatting with coworkers and then get home. Across the bar, a young man dressed as a mad scientist waves at Beam, inviting him over to his table. It takes a second, but Beam realizes that it's Curtis Schneider, a friend from Theranos and one of the smartest people Beam knows. So Beam approaches the table, trying his best to fake a smile. "Hey, Curtis, nice costume." "Costume? No, I dressed as myself, overworked R&D scientist." "Man, I hear that. I'm probably heading home soon, in fact." "Oh, Alan, stay out. Don't be one of those old guys who's always clocking out at 6. You'll end up in a graveyard like Yahoo or IBM. Come on, sit down. We got a lot to catch up on." Beam sets down his glass. "No, Curtis, it's late. I'll see you tomorrow, though." "Wait, you heard the news, right?" "No? What news? No one ever tells me anything." "Well, I guess I'm the one to break it to you. Apparently the FDA has some issues with our blood tests. They're considering holding back approval." You weren't aware of this?" Beam wipes his upper lip and looks away. The truth is, he knows exactly what Schneider is talking about. Theranos is developing what promises to be revolutionary medical technology. The company has caught the attention of the entire world, and its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, is now a billionaire. Things couldn't appear to be any better. But there's a hitch. Theranos needs approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And the dirty secret that Beam has discovered is that the technology doesn't work. But Beam isn't ready to share that hard news with his coworker. "Oh, FDA has some issues, huh?" No, I mean, I've heard rumors." "Alan, you run the lab. You're telling me Elizabeth doesn't fill you in?" "Well, you know how she is. Her code of silence." "Well, yeah, I mean, she knows how to keep a secret, but I don't get it. We have a partnership with Walgreens. We are acing our proficiency test. Why? What is the FDA seeing?" "Oh, man, who knows? But, I don't want to think about that. What are you watching on TV these days?" "Alan, stop. What the hell's going on?" "Nothing. I mean, it's government. You know the government types." "Alan, look at you. Your hand is shaking." "Man, I'm just tired. Look, is there something you're not telling me? Because I think I have a right to know. This affects me, too." "No, let's just leave it alone, okay?" "Huh. All right." Bean wipes the sweat from his forehead. "Oh, God, I'm sorry. It has been a long week." "Yeah, man, it's cool. All good. I'm sure everything's going to be fine. Go home." Beam gives a curt nod, but he knows that Schneider isn't right. Things haven't been fine for a long time now. Beam used to believe in Theranos, but his hopes have vanished. Theranos' faulty technology could soon see a wide public distribution. And if that happens, medical patients could get the wrong diagnoses and treatments. People could die. It's a catastrophe waiting to happen. So Beam downs the last of his warm beer and gets ready to make a confession. It's time to come clean. To Schneider, his coworkers, and the rest of the world. The tech industry is a force in the global economy. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Google generate billions in profits. And they've disrupted long-established industries from manufacturing to education to food delivery. But Silicon Valley has also had a large influence on our culture. The smartphone has come to dominate our eyes and ears. Many workplaces have adopted the open floor plans that are common in the tech industry. And luminaries like Steve Jobs have given us a powerful cultural myth, the genius who dared to dream big and change the world. Elizabeth Holmes aimed to be this kind of visionary. Charismatic and confident, Holmes founded Theranos as a medical startup. She promised cutting-edge devices that could run tests for hundreds of medical conditions using only a single drop of blood. Investors were dazzled by her vision, and seemingly overnight, Holmes had become a self-made billionaire and an icon in the tech industry. But behind closed doors, Holmes was scrambling to hide the shocking secret. Her company rested on a foundation of lies, and when this truth came to light, it would shock the world and expose a darker side of Silicon Valley. It's 1995 in Houston, Texas. The air is hot and humid, and a scrawny blonde sixth grader named Elizabeth Holmes is running on a dirt track. Holmes is drenched in sweat. She's huffing and wheezing, pushing herself to keep going, to fight through even if she's ready to give up. Holmes is running in her school's track meet, but she's in last place and far behind the rest of the pack. This is one feeling she can't stand. Holmes is a straight A student. She's accustomed to being the best, especially in science and her Mandarin classes. But being a good student doesn't make her popular. If she wants to stand out, she has to excel at something people actually care about, like track and field. So Holmes grits her teeth and keeps pushing herself as sweat continues to pour down the back of her neck. But as she runs, a whistle blows somewhere far off. For a moment, Holmes is confused, but then she realizes what's happened. The announcers have called the race. They must think all the runners have crossed the finish line. Up ahead, the audience begins to scatter, even though Holmes is still out on the track. But the announcer calls out and tells everyone to wait. There's still one runner who needs to finish. Holmes feels every head turn in her direction, and then she hears it. Jeering. People in the stands are laughing at her, yelling out that she should give up and go home. Holmes' face is red with humiliation. She wanted some attention, to be something more than just bookish. But this wasn't the attention she was looking for, to look like a fool. Holmes starts to panic, trying to figure out what to do. And then, from the corner of her eye, she spots her friend Megan Long running over. Long matches her pace, jogging beside Holmes. She lays a hand on Holmes' arm, begging her to step off the track to call it quits. Holmes sees pity in her friend's eyes, and it fills her with even more shame. This is the worst feeling in the world. Looking like a loser, a failure in front of everyone. Hot tears burst from Holmes' eyes, but she swallows down the embarrassment and continues running down the track. The finish line is just ahead. It would be easy to stop now and preserve some measure of dignity, but something in Holmes won't let her give up. Clenching her jaws, Holmes runs faster, and leaving her friend behind, the wind blows across her face. A moment later, she crosses the finish line, the yellow streamer already severed and flapping in the lazy wind. As she stands, catching her breath, Holmes realizes her ploy for distinction in sports was a failure. But there are other ways. She's going to find something else, something bigger than all of this. And she'll never forget this feeling. She'll never come in last place again. 7 years later, Elizabeth Holmes is now 18 years old, a freshman at Stanford University, where she studies biotechnology. But tonight, she's back home in Houston, Texas, celebrating Christmas at her parents' house. For days, she's been eager for this moment, because she has something important to announce, a major life decision. Holmes lays down her fork and knife and glances around the table. Hey, everyone. Everyone stop. I have something I want to share. Holmes's brother, mother, and father turn to her. She feels a jolt of nervous excitement. So, I've been thinking about things, and I've made a decision. I'm gonna drop out. Holmes' father sets down his fork. Drop out? Drop out of what? A club on campus? No, Dad, not a club. Stanford, I'm dropping out of school. Liz, what are you talking about? Why would you drop out? Stanford was your dream. No, it was your dream. My dream is to become a billionaire. Liz, how are you going to do that without a college degree? Bill Gates, Michael Dell, Steve Jobs, they all dropped out. And all of them founded their companies before they were 30. And I can't fall behind. I can't sit around some college and waste my time. I've got to get building. Holmes' father stands up from the table. then grabs a sheet of paper from somewhere in the kitchen. He jots something down. Then he folds it into a paper airplane and tosses it across the table. It hits Holmes in the shoulder. "Open it." Holmes shakes her head, exasperated, but unfolds the paper airplane, and inside there are only 3 letters. PhD. "Dad, I don't want a PhD. I mean, look at us. Our families founded the Cincinnati General Hospital and the Fleischmann Yeast Company. Being an entrepreneur is in my DNA. Liz. My father and my grandfather, they had more money than they knew what to do with, spending most of it on cars and homes, but none of it made them happy. Look, I've spent my entire career working in war-torn countries. Dad, I don't need a speech. It's not a speech. Happiness doesn't come from money or possessions. It comes from purpose, having a meaningful life. If you want to make a splash, that's fine, but don't do it for profit. Do it to improve the world." Holmes crosses her arms and looks away. But when she looks back at her father, she nods. "Elizabeth, that's our legacy. That's what's in your DNA. Not being an entrepreneur, but changing the damn world. Don't let me down." Holmes avoids her father's gaze. She's not ready to admit it, but he might have a point. Still, she won't budge on her intentions. At some point, Holmes will drop out of Stanford. Some opportunity will present itself, and she'll be ready for it. And when it does, maybe there's a way she can make a name for herself and improve the world. It's the summer of 2003 in a medical laboratory in Singapore. The vast space is cold and silent, and 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes hovers over an industrial lab bench. She's wearing a white coat and protective goggles, and from a plastic rack she removes a sample of blood. Holmes turns to a computer and logs data about the sample. Then she drops the tube into a centrifuge where it's spun and the blood platelets separates from the plasma. And then she prepares to do the same thing again. One sample after another, first logged, then spun, and then again and again. It's repetitive work, part of her summer internship at the Genome Institute of Singapore. At this lab, she's testing blood samples from patients who've been infected with the SARS virus. When Holmes accepted the position, she believed she'd be doing important work. The SARS outbreak was big, a global event. But now that she's here in Singapore, Holmes can't help but feel discouraged. Lab work is boring. She wishes she could be doing something else, something more exciting. Holmes turns, yawning into the sleeve of her lab coat. That's when she sees her supervisor moving down the rows, checking in on the lab techs. She's a tiny, severe woman with a black bob, and she seems to have very little time for the interns. But Holmes wants to impress. Maybe if she proves that she's better than the other interns, she can do something that's a little more creative and less monotonous. When her supervisor reaches her, Holmes tells her that she's been thinking about these blood samples. It took a lot of work to collect them, all the needles and tubes. It seems needlessly painful. And then there's the testing. It's laborious, not to mention inefficient. Holmes takes a deep breath and says she wonders if there aren't other methods to collect and test blood samples. Maybe if she and the supervisor worked together, they could find a better way. Holmes smiles, waiting for the supervisor's praise. She's hoping that she just proves she's not a passive intern, but that she's here to contribute. But her supervisor just shakes her head annoyed. She says there is no better way. This work that Holmes is doing is the gold standard, and if Holmes is going to work in the field, she better get used to it. The supervisor turns on her heels and walks away. Holmes is shocked to be so rebuffed. She looks around for some kind of moral support, but the other interns just keep their eyes down. Holmes grumbles as she returns to her work. It's clear that this industry has no vision. There's got to be a better way to do this. And if she could invent that method, she wouldn't just improve the lives of countless interns like herself. It would be much bigger than that. Holmes could change the entire medical industry. She could be famous and rich and live a meaningful life. Holmes smiles as she logs the next blood sample. She won't be in this lab forever. And as soon as she's back in the United States, she's going to start developing the next great idea in Silicon Valley. It's the fall of 2003 in Palo Alto, California. Shanak Roy hangs up his lab coat and pulls on a loose blazer. He glances around his small, messy office, which is cluttered with dog-eared books and stacks of paper. It's not exactly the kind of place where you'd normally hold a business meeting, but business looks a lot different here in Silicon Valley. Roy is a PhD student at Stanford. He researches biochemical reactions, but soon he'll finish his graduate studies and head out into the world to start a full-time job. He knows he should probably find something safe and stable. It would make his parents happy. They're both immigrants, and he was raised with the values of hard work and being practical. Still, Roy can't ignore a quiet voice inside him. It whispers every time he looks online and sees a listing for another normal and boring job. Roy wants something more, something exciting, something visionary. Maybe something here in Silicon Valley at one of the tech companies. And that's why in a few minutes, he and his academic advisor are going to sit down with one of his lab assistants. Her name is Elizabeth Holmes, and apparently she has an innovative idea for a startup. She wants Roy to be part of the business. Outside his office, Roy hears muffled voices approaching. Then there's a knock on the door, and when he opens it, he finds Holmes standing side by side with his advisor. Holmes' blonde hair looks frizzy and matted, like she just woke up from a nap. Her eyes are ringed with dark circles. She clearly has not been sleeping well. Still, as Holmes and the advisor enter the office, it's clear that her energy is anything but flagging. Her eyes wide with passion, Holmes tells Roy that he's about to have a life-changing meeting. Roy grins, drawn in by her magnetic charisma. Working in the lab together, she never seemed like she was the next Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs. She was always hardworking and curious, but so is every other sophomore at Stanford. Still, Holmes managed to talk her way into a graduate-level chemical engineering class, as well as a research apprenticeship, and Roy's advisor is over the moon about Holmes' business idea. So while Roy isn't easily dazzled, he's also not so close-minded. If there's something to Holmes' idea, it could be the perfect launchpad for his own career. Roy takes a seat across from Holmes and says he's ready for the pitch. Holmes launches into it, starting with her internship in Singapore. She worked with blood samples there, but the labor was repetitive and the technology badly outdated. She knew there had to be a better way to test people's blood for diseases and other health conditions. So when Holmes returned to the States, she got right to work. She slept only maybe 1 or 2 hours every night and spent the rest of the time developing what could be a game-changing piece of technology. It's something that she's calling the TheraPatch. Holmes reaches into her backpack and takes out a stapled set of documents, which she hands over to Roy. This, she says, is her patent for the TheraPatch. It works by applying a small adhesive patch to a patient's skin. The patch painlessly draws up a small amount of blood, and with an embedded microchip, it analyzes the blood in real time. Then the patch injects any necessary drugs into the patient and provides diagnostics to a patient's doctor. Roy studies the sketches of the patch with its series of tiny needles. The whole thing sounds like science fiction, but he's intrigued and wants to know more. So Roy asks Holmes what conditions the patch could treat, how would it diagnose illnesses, and how will something so small actually deliver medicine. One by one, Holmes answers the questions, speaking with a fiery passion. And while her responses are still rough, Roy has to give it to her. Elizabeth Holmes is inspiring. And she's right. The blood testing industry is ripe for disruption. The right approach, something simple, something modern and efficient, could revolutionize the entire medical industry. Roy looks up from the patent files and finds Holmes beaming with a smile. She says she's really enjoyed working with him in the lab. Roy is remarkably talented, and that's why she wants him to be part of her business. She needs a skilled researcher to set up a lab and begin work on the TheraPatch prototype. Roy pauses as he mulls over the offer. This is exactly the kind of opportunity that he's dreamed of. At the same time, it's a risky idea. He could spend years of his life working on a silly passion project, something that might go nowhere, while his fellow grad students build their careers at real companies. But Roy can't ignore the voice that's always whispered in his ear. He was meant to do something bigger and different, and this could be the chance of a lifetime. Roy smiles and nods. He's in. Together, Roy and Holmes will create a piece of technology that could change the world, And along the way, they could grow very rich. About 10 months later, Elizabeth Holmes steps into a glass-walled conference room in Northern California. She opens her laptop and begins reviewing her PowerPoint slides. Page after page of diagrams, figures, and images. By itself, Holmes's patent means nothing. She had to create a business, find office and lab space, hire employees. And to do that, she needs some real money. So this PowerPoint presentation is the culmination of all the hard work that she and Shaunak Roy have done in the last few months, ever since she dropped out of Stanford. The presentation all leads to a single argument. The technology is too revolutionary, the potential too big. It would be crazy not to invest in her startup, a company she's now calling Theranos. A door opens down the hallway, and Holmes glances up and sees a woman with round, colorful glasses and a blonde bob. Holmes takes a deep breath. Annette Campbell White might look like someone's sweet and caring mother, but she is one of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. She's a venture capitalist and makes massive investments in medical startups. And while Holmes has already raised some money through family connections, she needs deeper pockets in order to build a successful company. Campbell White has that kind of money. But Campbell White is a famously shrewd investor, and if she's going to sink millions into Theranos, Holmes is going to have to impress her. The conference room door swings open, and Campbell White approaches with an outstretched hand. "Miss Holmes, I've heard a lot about you. I hope mostly good things. The Valley knows how to spot real talent. I'm curious to hear about this new device you're working on. Well, I know you see a lot of tech, and I'm sure you get a lot of good pitches. But I have no doubt you're going to remember this moment for the rest of your life." Confidence. Oh, I like it. Let's get to it. Why don't you walk me through your pitch? Holmes gathers herself as she launches her PowerPoint. She's practiced this speech 1,000 times and knows every word by heart. Well, let's go back, because even though it's unconventional, you have to understand something about my childhood. When I was young, more than anything, I hated getting my blood drawn. Genetics are funny, you know. My mother, she has a terrible fear of needles. If she even sees a syringe, she just faints. And I guess I inherited that phobia. And for some like me, it does really make life hard. Going to the doctors, all the needles. But I'm not the only one. There are millions of people who can't stand to get their blood drawn. And all that made me wonder, what if there was a better way? Holmes turns and clicks over to the next slide in her presentation. This is the TheraPatch. It's an adhesive patch that, and this is key, painlessly draws blood from a patient and then makes a diagnosis for a wide number of medical conditions. After that, it directly administers any necessary drugs. I'm sorry, this patch draws blood, tests it, diagnoses the disease, and then medicates the patient? Exactly. Now, I don't have to explain it to you. I'm sure you can see the way this transforms medicine. Not only that, it would change patients' lives. Holmes takes a sip of water, pleased with her delivery so far. But she notices that Campbell White is frowning. This is an admirable goal, Miss Holmes, but I don't understand. How would a microchip deliver medicine and communicate with your doctor? Everything would be wireless, housed directly inside the patch. No, I gathered that. But wireless communication requires a set of components completely different from diagnostic components. And then the transdermal medication, a whole new set. That's a lot of tech to cram into a 2-inch patch. That's true. And I like the idea of getting test results from a patch, but there's already another company that's cornered the market on that sort of product. What's the differentiator? How is Theranos better? Holmes feels her face grow hot. No, I'm sorry. I think you're missing the point. Miss Holmes, I listened to every word of your presentation. I've seen your deck. I very rarely miss the point. This is groundbreaking technology. Yeah, in theory, that may be true. But you haven't explained how it actually works. Does it work? Holmes tries to steady herself, but she feels her face flush again. And then the words come pouring out of her mouth. You know, Annette, I thought you'd be the right partner for my business. I thought you were someone who had vision. But clearly I was wrong. So, good luck with everything. Holmes stands up and leaves the office. As she exits the building and walks through the parking lot, Holmes' arms and legs start shaking. She can't believe what just happened. She was supposed to walk away with an offer for millions of dollars. Instead, she was made to sound like a child, someone who wasn't ready for the real world. It was a humiliating experience, but Holmes won't be stopped by a small-minded venture capitalist. This meeting was just a setback, but it taught her an important lesson. She needs to find investors who understand her vision and who won't get bogged down by details. If she can find those people, she should have no trouble getting all the money she needs and building Theranos into an empire. About a year later, Shaunak Roy makes his way through a recently expanded office in Palo Alto, California. As he walks through the wide-open space, Roy marvels at all the employees bustling about. The past 18 months have been a whirlwind, but Elizabeth Holmes has managed to raise $6 million in venture capital. That's not only allowed them to open this office, which belongs to Theranos, but they were able to hire an entire staff and build out a professional lab. Roy looks around and shakes his head in happy disbelief. It feels like only yesterday that the two of them were running a young startup with their backs against the wall. But everything seems to have changed overnight, and that includes Holmes herself. As Roy turns a corner in the new office, he sees his Theranos co-founder standing in front of yet another group of investors. She's wearing a black turtleneck and tailored slacks, looking just like her hero, Steve Jobs. She's also begun carrying herself with the swagger of a legendary CEO. So while Theranos may not yet be famous, that hasn't stopped Holmes from taking on the role of dynamic CEO and hatching ambitious plans. She wants to license their product to pharmaceutical companies conducting drug trials. Holmes has promised that their devices will offer real-time data, showing the companies whether the patients are having adverse reactions to the drugs. It could be a game-changer for the trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. But Roy worries about delivering on their promises, especially on Holmes' tight timeline. It helps that they've scrapped the original TheraPatch idea and instead are developing a handheld machine. Still, Holmes refuses to listen when Roy shares his concerns. That's why he's on his way to the Theranos lab. He needs to get someone else's point of view to see whether his worries are justified. Roy steps inside the lab and greets one of the technicians, who lifts his protective goggles and smiles. In a hushed tone, Roy inquires whether they've made any progress on the latest prototype. Right away, the technician's smile fades. Looking across the gleaming lab equipment, the technician tells Roy that they are still facing some fundamental struggles, like separating out the constituencies of blood samples. The mechanics are proving incredibly hard. Roy nods and asks the lab tech to be straight with him. Does he believe the product is feasible? The technician freezes for a moment, unsure what to say. Roy knows that no one wants to be the bearer of bad news, especially in a company with such large ambitions. But then the lab tech smiles again. He tells Roy that maybe they'll get lucky, and gesturing to the decorations dangling throughout the office, he tells Roy maybe there'll be a Christmas miracle. It's that time of year. Then the technician puts his goggles back on and returns to work. Roy's heart sinks as he turns and exits the lab. He told himself he wanted to hear the truth, even if it made him uncomfortable. But if he's being honest with himself, what Roy really wanted to hear was that they were on track, that everything would be all right. Because if that were true, if Theranos was actually getting closer to a viable product, then Roy could rest easy, knowing that he'd made the right choice in getting involved in this startup. But as things stand now, Roy isn't sure what the future will hold. And increasingly, it seems like he's made a big mistake. It's 2006 in Palo Alto, California, and late at night. By now, most of the employees at Theranos have gone home for the evening, but not Elizabeth Holmes. Theranos' founder and CEO is still at the company office, getting ready for an important meeting. Holmes knows it's unusual to do business this late, but some things can't wait. Holmes just bought a $2 million packaging system designed to ship Theranos' blood testing product as soon as it's ready. But the product is still far from done. There always seems to be some kind of delay. And that's left Theranos in crisis mode. They've already blown through their first $6 million in funding. Holmes has put on a good performance and managed to raise another $9 million, but she's worried that it won't last long. And if Theranos runs out of money, it'll be seen as one of the biggest embarrassments in Silicon Valley. So it's time to put some pressure on one of Theranos' top employees. Holmes walks through the office and approaches a man with slumped shoulders. His name is Edmund Koo, and he's the head of engineering for Theranos. Oh, Elizabeth. I'm sorry I'm here so late. I've lost track of time. That seems like a habit of yours, isn't it? Sorry? Well, no, here, have a seat. No, I'll stand. This won't take long. Okay. But look, I want to apologize about something. Ed, it's time to stop apologizing. Now tell me what I want to hear. No, okay, I won't apologize. I'll be honest. My team is still struggling with the prototype. Now, I know you've had some qualms about this, but if we just use more blood in the samples, it could change everything. The product would have a much better chance of working if we weren't using so little blood. Ed, I made myself clear. No more blood. Now, you're an engineer, and you fix technical problems. And that's what I hired you for. No more blood. As CEO of this company, I've made promises to my investors. I said we could create a device that fits in the palm of your hand and that works with just one drop of blood. I understand. So you also understand how important it is to keep that promise. Yes, I do. But Ed, if we don't build this product, some other company will. And I won't let you be the reason why we fail. Koo freezes, stunned. Liz, I'm doing the best I can, but issues keep stacking up. Using so little blood, cross-contamination. Nothing is impossible, but I need to speak to the guys in chemistry. Maybe we can solve this together. No, that's another thing I've made perfectly clear. You and every other employee are only allowed to speak with your direct teams. But we could solve this problem if we were able to talk together. You could also leak company secrets. Liz, no, we're done here. No more delays. Make this work. Koo dips his head and nods before walking away. When he's gone, Holmes takes a deep breath and tries to figure out her next steps. Koo wasn't wrong. The departments would work better if they could team up and collaborate. But Holmes wasn't wrong either. In Silicon Valley, people talk. And if sensitive details about Theranos were to go public, they could lose their advantage and get beaten to market by someone else. So Holmes made a final decision. She will be the only person who will see the full picture of Theranos. And no matter what she has to do, hire people, fire people, raise millions more from venture capitalists, somehow, Theranos will succeed. Later in 2006, Theranos Chief Financial Officer Henry Moseley heads through the company office. Under his arm is a notebook, and inside is a set of records that paints a troubling picture. Moseley is a numbers guy, and for the last 8 months, he's overseen every aspect of Theranos' financial operations. And that includes projected revenues once Theranos begins selling its blood testing technology. The company is currently valued at $165 million. It's a strong valuation, but the problem is Moseley believes the numbers are inflated. It's a worry that's grown especially strong after he learned something troubling. Moseley needs to speak with Elizabeth Holmes to share his worries. If she's the visionary leader that everyone thinks she is, Moseley is certain she'll do the right thing. When Moseley reaches Holmes' office, the CEO smiles and invites him in. She tells Moseley that it's time to celebrate. She was recently in Switzerland, meeting with Novartis, the Swiss pharmaceutical giant. It turns out the company is interested in working with Theranos. Moseley swallows hard at the mention of this meeting. That's exactly what he wanted to talk about. So he steps forward and tells Holmes that from what he heard, the meeting didn't go so well. Apparently there was something wrong with the demonstration of Theranos' technology. Holmes smiles and waves her hand dismissively. She tells Moseley that that was just a minor issue, nothing to be concerned about. But Moseley presses the issue, telling Holmes that it didn't sound minor. Just this morning, Theranos' co-founder Shaunak Roy admitted that during the meeting, their devices started malfunctioning. The team resorted to a workaround. They showed pre-recorded test results. It made it look like the technology was doing what it was supposed to do, but it was a fake presentation. Holmes taps her desk, her smile growing icy, and explains that everything is fine. Their technology will work just as promised. It was just a tactic to buy time. Moseley can't believe what he's hearing. It sounds like the devices are still far from operational. And if the company is lying to their investors, they're committing fraud. Holmes rises from her desk, a menacing look in her eyes now. And she tells Mosley that he's clearly not a team player. He should leave. He doesn't belong with Theranos. For a moment, Mosley stands staring in confusion. But then the truth sinks in. He was just fired. Mosley begins to leave the office, but before he steps out, he takes one last look at Holmes. When he first met her, she was charismatic, a brilliant dreamer who could change the world. Looking at her now, Mosley can see that old Elizabeth is gone. Maybe she was never there in the first place. It's November 2007 in Palo Alto, California. Theranos co-founder Shanak Roy exits the company break room and trudges past a group of employees working silently in their cubicles. They look weary and beaten down, and Roy can't blame them. In recent months, the atmosphere at the office has grown increasingly oppressive. Word has gotten out that Elizabeth Holmes is now suing 3 former employees, claiming they stole the company's intellectual property. She somehow even got the FBI involved. Well, her paranoia didn't end there. It seems that every day, Holmes institutes some new security protocol or reminds employees that if they slip up, they could be sued. But in public, Holmes continues to sell her grand vision for Theranos. Behind closed doors, the company is under lockdown. It can't go on like this. Things have gotten out of control, and Roy is determined to make some changes. No more secrets. No more impossible promises to investors or half-truths. This culture of fear has to end. So Roy heads toward Holmes's office, ready to have a word with her. But as he rounds a corner, he can hear she's already with someone. Muffled voices rise and fall, and Roy slows to a stop as her glass-walled office comes into view. Behind her desk, Holmes is flanked by a group of people, including her lawyer. And across from them sits a man with dark hair whose head is hanging low. It's Roy's friend and colleague, Edmund Koo, the head of engineering at Theranos. Roy's heart starts to pound as he looks into the room. It's obvious what's happening. Koo is being fired. A moment later, the door swings open and Koo exits. He looks defeated and drained, unsure where to go or what to do next. Roy doesn't know what to do either, so he lays a hand on his friend's shoulder. Suddenly, Koo looks up, his face bitter and angry. He tells Roy that he's heartbroken. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They were supposed to be changing the world. Koo furrows his eyebrows and tells Roy that he's a smart man, too smart to keep working with Holmes. Roy ought to leave. Otherwise, Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes will ruin him. Roy searches for a response, but he doesn't have one. And soon, Koo turns and heads for the exit. Roy stands alone in the hallway. Several years ago, he took a risk. His former lab assistant, a teenage undergrad, convinced him to abandon a safe career to join a startup. It had been so exhilarating at the time. But now Roy feels nothing but regret. This may have been the biggest mistake of his life. He helped create a toxic company that's burning through money and may never accomplish anything. This whole thing could turn out to be an incredible waste of time and money. Part of Roy still wishes he could change the company, to force a new era of transparency and openness, to stop bleeding money and firing talented employees. Theranos could still be something special. But deep in his heart, Roy knows the truth. Theranos is unfixable. He can only try to leave before it's too late. It's February 2010 in Palo Alto, California. Inside Theranos headquarters, a column of sunlight streams through the windows, landing on Chelsea Burkett, one of the company's employees. Burkett shades her pale blue eyes as she rounds a corner. And when she arrives at the office of the company's CEO, Elizabeth Holmes, Burkett pauses. Today is not going to be easy. Burkett and Holmes have been friends for years, and just 6 months ago, Holmes hired Burkett to come work at Theranos. At first, it seemed like a dream job. Burkett would set up studies with the company's blood testing devices. She would get to travel the world, helping develop a new piece of medical technology that could save people's lives. But these last few months, Burkett has grown deeply pessimistic. Theranos' company culture has grown toxic under the leadership of Sunny Balwani, a senior executive. Balwani is a harsh and cruel leader, and he also happens to be Elizabeth Holmes' boyfriend. But bad leadership isn't the only problem. There's also all the gossip that's circulating among employees, inflated revenue projections, mysterious firings, bribes to foreign governments. All of that has been upsetting for Burkett, but then came the breaking point. Holmes convinced a man having a health scare to let Theranos test his blood for cancer. The implication was that he should use the results to make medical decisions with life or death consequences. Burkett was shocked. Theranos' technology is still far from ready, but it was clear that Holmes and Theranos would continue to act recklessly. So now, as Burkett hovers outside Holmes' office, she gathers her courage and gets ready to deliver some uncomfortable news. Inside her office, Elizabeth Holmes hangs up the phone and waves Burkett to come inside. Burkett enters, where she finds Holmes sitting behind her desk with a smile. "Hey, Chelsea. Sorry, I was on the phone with the board. Come on in." Burkett nods, taking a seat across from Holmes. As she looks at her old college friend, she can't help but notice how tired she looks. And thin. "Oh, thanks, Liz. How are you? Do you do anything except work? You getting any sleep?" "Well, we're growing fast, so being tired comes with the territory. But what's up? What's on your mind?" "The reason I'm here is, well, this is hard. I can't tell you how much I appreciate working for you." "Oh? Is this bad news?" "Yeah, I'm sorry. This job isn't working for me." Holmes leans forward, her hands clutched together. Is this a joke?" "No, Liz, I'm serious. I'm giving my notice. Chelsea, I handed you an incredible position. You've traveled the world making a difference. This is the kind of stuff that we dreamed about at Stanford." "Yes, yeah, I know. And what is it?" Burkett pauses. She needs to be discreet. The tech world is a small place, and she doesn't want to say anything that could hurt her own future. So she's only going to share part of the truth. "Well, you know my boyfriend's in LA, so every weekend I'm flying back and forth and, it's getting exhausting. I can't keep doing it." "So it's not the problems with the studies you've been leading?" No. Because, Chelsea, we're fixing the tech. I know you've hit some rough patches, but that's what happens when you work at a startup." "No, it's not the tech. It's not the studies. I just can't do it. I miss my boyfriend. That's back and forth is killing me. It's just what I need." There's a flash of anger behind Holmes' eyes. "Chelsea, you've been here 6 months. No one gets a dream job in the Valley and then throws it away because they're annoyed by a flight to LA that takes just an hour. You're not telling me everything." "No, that's it. You don't even have the courage to admit the truth." "Well, whatever it is, you can just leave. Just go. We'll be fine without you, believe me." "Liz, and on your way out, don't say anything to your direct reports. We're done here." Burkett wants to protest, to plead her case and win back her friend's approval. But it's too late for that. Holmes has turned away, her back to Burkett now, and begins typing something on her computer. Burkett had heard the stories about Holmes, how she could be ruthless and ignore people who disagreed with her. But she never experienced this side of her old friend. It's painful to witness. So without saying another word, Burkett rises and walks out of Theranos headquarters. Burkett steps into the blinding Palo Alto sun, her emotions whirling. Part of her is relieved to be done with Theranos. Still, Burkett worries about Holmes. She seems more isolated, more deluded than she's ever been. Theranos is a deeply troubled company, and yet Holmes refuses to address the underlying problems. Burkett is no visionary, no titan of the tech industry. But you don't have to be to see the truth. Theranos is on a dangerous course. And if Holmes doesn't make some radical changes, and make them soon, her company could soon fall apart. At the age of 19, Elizabeth Holmes set out to build a product that would revolutionize healthcare. Her company, Theranos, worked to develop new blood testing technology, which could diagnose a wide variety of medical issues using just the smallest drop of blood. To build her company, Holmes courted a number of Silicon Valley investors. Her pitch relied on a mixture of charisma and inflated projections about the company's growth. Holmes also hid some of the problems with the technology itself. But as Theranos prepared to go public with its blood testing devices, Holmes and her company faced increasing scrutiny. And with opposition mounting, Holmes found herself in a desperate scramble to stay ahead of her critics. It's late August 2010 at Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto, California. Elizabeth Holmes steps into a conference room where she finds a group of executives sitting at a long table. They're members of a delegation from Walgreens, and they're here today to discuss a partnership between the drugstore chain and Theranos. Holmes smiles as she greets the group. Theranos may soon be able to place its blood testing devices inside Walgreens stores. The two sides are currently working to launch a pilot program, and if all goes well, Walgreens will expand this partnership nationwide. The revenue stream could be massive and cement Theranos' reputation as a leader in tech. It would be a validation of Holmes' vision and exhausting work. Theranos' blood testing devices aren't yet ready for the public, but for Holmes, that's not a deal breaker. They'll be ready when it's time. For now, though, she just needs to win over this group and deflect any concerns they may have about Theranos' technology. Inside the conference room, Holmes turns and launches a PowerPoint presentation. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here. Before we jump into things, I want you to just let yourself dream. Imagine what this partnership would actually look like. Maybe there's a little girl who's been tired and lethargic. She and her mom live out in rural Alabama. Not a lot of hospitals out there, but there are Walgreens. So they go in, and the little girl gets a test with just a pinprick of blood. In less than an hour, they get the result. The girl has a deficiency in vitamin B, a simple, treatable condition. And now the family can go back to living their lives, and the girl can get back to laughing and playing in the yard. Holmes clicks forward to the next slide. That's the promise of this partnership. Together, Walgreens and Theranos can fill a huge gap left by our healthcare system and give regular people the care they need and the care they deserve at a price that won't drain their savings. There's nodding approval from the executives, and Holmes grins with pride. So far, so good. So she turns back to her presentation. But then a voice from the corner interrupts her. Excuse me, Miss Holmes? Quick question. Holmes turns to Kevin Hunter, a thick-set man who runs a consulting firm. Hunter is an expert in clinical lab work, and he's helping Walgreens evaluate the partnership. Well, first, I just want to say thank you for having us. Your vision is incredible. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned that you have a commercially ready lab? That's right, state of the art. That's cool. I'm a science geek myself. But I was coming back from the bathroom, and I didn't see anything that looked like a lab. Holmes freezes. The fact is, their labs are far from commercially ready. But in Silicon Valley, sometimes you have to sell a story that makes people dream, even if it bends the truth. Well, Kevin, of course you didn't see the lab. It's downstairs. And I promise it's all that it's hyped up to be. Now, back to the presentation. Holmes clicks to the next slide, but Hunter interjects again. Miss Holmes, I really do want to see the lab. Is that possible? Yes, of course, if we have the time. Well, time shouldn't be an issue. I know we plan to end early, go to dinner. Why don't we take a detour? Check out the lab first. Well, I'm afraid our schedule's a little tighter than that. The restaurant has an incredibly strict reservation policy. We can't be late. Well, then we'll find another time to see the lab. Holmes puts on a genial smile. You know, Kevin, I do appreciate the interest. Let's get through the important stuff first, and after that, we'll see if we can do fun tours and all that, all right? Hunter leans back in his chair, his arms folded. Holmes knows she has to quickly redirect the conversation so she won't get any more questions about the lab or their product, because Holmes made a large promise claiming that Theranos' technology could run 192 different kinds of blood tests, but so far it can only accomplish about a half that number. But it's just an engineering problem, one that Holmes is certain they'll soon fix. The employees will work harder, and soon Theranos will be ready for a national rollout of its blood testing devices. It's just a matter of time and working out a few kinks. And Walgreens doesn't need to know everything going on in the background anyways. So Holmes clasps her hands together, and smiling brightly, she begins telling the group about Theranos' new research in Mexico. There have been a number of findings that should be exciting for Walgreens. As executives chatter over the news, Holmes steadies herself, remaining poised. She knows that Theranos will get there. Eventually, they will achieve the impossible. But in the meantime, she can't let this deal with Walgreens fall through. A few months later, Kevin Hunter squeezes into a boardroom at the Walgreens corporate headquarters in Deerfield, Illinois. The conference table is littered with turkey sandwiches, and the other executives are getting ready for their weekly video call with Theranos. As Hunter waits for the call to begin, his mind races as he remembers his first visit to Theranos at their Palo Alto headquarters. Hunter is a consultant working for Walgreens, helping to evaluate the partnership with Theranos. And when he flew out to California, he wanted to vet the company's actual technology. He wasn't interested in the PowerPoint presentations, but in the devices themselves, in their ability to test blood. That was the only way he could tell if Theranos was the real deal. But in that visit to Palo Alto, Hunter hit roadblock after roadblock. Elizabeth Holmes deflected all of his requests. He wasn't allowed to see Theranos' lab or to witness a demonstration of a live test of Theranos' device. On top of that, Theranos' executive, Sunny Balwani, trailed him when he went to the bathroom. It was like they were trying to hide something, and it left Hunter deeply suspicious of Holmes and her biotech company. So, sitting around the board table with the Walgreens executives, Hunter thinks through his plan. Somehow, he must stop this deal from moving forward. A moment later, the video call begins, and Elizabeth Holmes' face appears on a large screen. In her distinctive, low voice, Holmes says she'd like to start the meeting with some housekeeping. Theranos is changing the way it deals with government regulators. From now on, Theranos will designate their tests in a legal category known as laboratory developed. Holmes flips a page, and then breezily moves on to the next topic. But Kevin Hunter's ears prick up. Did Holmes really just say that? This new designation means that Theranos' devices will be less closely regulated by the FDA, and it could present a major liability for Walgreens. Hunter is shaken, and when the call finally ends, he pulls aside Renat Vandenhoof, the Walgreens executive who's leading the pilot project. Hunter explains that he's very concerned about what Holmes just said. Theranos' legal maneuvering could put Walgreens in a precarious position, and alongside all of Hunter's other worries, this seems to add up to something bad. Walgreens needs to get to the bottom of this before it's too late and they have a lawsuit on their hands. Vandenhoof's expression is pained. He admits that he hears what Hunter is saying, but at this point, they can't put the brakes on the deal. Walgreens is battling CVS to be the dominant drugstore chain across the country. If Walgreens doesn't take this opportunity, CVS will. Vandenhoof then gives a shrug and says he knows this isn't what Hunter wants to hear, but it's the way things are. Vandenhoof turns to leave, but before he can, Hunter grabs his arm and begins pleading. He says there's another way to vet Theranos' technology. He could open up one of the devices the company left behind. They could pull back the curtain and see what Holmes is really working with. Vandenhoof's eyes widen in alarm. He reminds Hunter that their contract prohibits any reverse engineering of Theranos' devices. Cracking one open is out of the question. Vandenhoof turns, tosses his half-eaten sandwich in the trash, and walks away. Hunter is left standing in a daze. He understands why the situation is difficult. Walking away from a deal with Theranos could cost Walgreens millions, billions over the long term. But there is a bigger cost to consider. Theranos' products could be defective, and if this partnership goes forward, Walgreens could cost lives. Hunter sighs. At this point, there's little he can do. He's just a consultant from a small firm, and trying to upend a major corporate deal like this, there's just too much momentum to stop it. It's September 2013, and 3 years later at Theranos' headquarters in Palo Alto. The company's lab director, Alan Beam, makes his way through the office, surveying a landscape of exhausted employees. Engineers, product developers, researchers, everyone looks depleted. It's no shock that the company appears to be staffed by zombies. For the last 3 years, Theranos employees have suffered through a relentless workload, as Theranos has prepared a commercial launch of its blood testing technology. The company's deal with Walgreens could be a game changer. By getting their technology in drugstores across the country, Theranos will be able to reach millions of people and make an incredible amount of money. The stakes couldn't be greater for Theranos. In just a few days, they'll open its first wellness center inside a Walgreens in Palo Alto. But there's a problem, one that Beam just learned. Theranos' devices still aren't ready for the public. Theranos may be under incredible pressure, but Beam knows he has to stop the partnership from moving forward. Only one person can make this excruciating decision, the company's founder and CEO, Elizabeth Holmes. Beam approaches Holmes' office and knocks on the door. But when she looks up, he notices that her eyes are ringed with dark circles. Beam has heard rumors that Holmes sleeps only 4 hours a night, that she lives on chocolate-covered coffee beans. Now, looking at Holmes rock back and forth in her seat, Beam sees that the rumors could be true. So Beam gingerly steps into the office and takes a seat. But before he can share his deep concerns, Holmes begins talking rapidly, saying that this Walgreens launch is going to change everything. And not just for Theranos. People everywhere are going to find that they can get medical tests as easily as shopping for groceries. Beam looks down. He doesn't know why he's getting the pitch that Holmes saves for investors. Maybe all her frantic energies just cover for her true feelings. Maybe she's also scared. Because the truth is that if Theranos launches in Walgreens, it will have to not just use its own technology to test blood. They'll have to rely on devices manufactured by Siemens, the industrial giant. And even those tests have proven problematic. So despite all of Theranos' promises and years of work, the partnership with Walgreens isn't ready. Beam knows he has to tread carefully. So meeting Holmes' gaze, he agrees that the Walgreens partnership has big potential. And it's for that reason that they have to postpone the launch and work to fix the long list of problems. Hearing this suggestion, Holmes looks away, shakes her head. She tells Beam that it's not an option. They cannot delay. They're going to have to fix this airplane as they fly it. Beam shudders at the analogy. He could be held personally liable for any faulty test results. He can't risk that, so he leans forward and issues a demand. It's not just that she should delay the launch. Holmes must call it off. But Holmes shakes her head again, looking bitter and weary. She explains that Theranos' only currency is its promise. Postponing the launch could damage their reputation beyond repair. It's not a decision she's willing to make. Beam begins to try again, but Holmes raises her hand to silence him. And with her voice quivering, she tells Beam that somehow everything will be fine. Holmes ushers Beam out of her office and into the hallway. For a moment, Beam just stands there, watching Holmes through her glass door. She puts on a pair of headphones and soon is nodding along to music, her eyes closed. Beam stares in disbelief. Holmes' habit of sticking her head in the sand is more than naive. It's dangerous. Theranos is careening toward outright fraud. Patients' lives are at stake. Someone has to speak up and put a stop to this. The only question is whether Beam himself has the strength to take on Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. It's the summer of 2013 in Palo Alto, California, and the Theranos cafeteria is bustling. Employees grab their lunch trays as they laugh and blow off steam, their conversation echoing off the walls. One of those employees is Tyler Schultz, who grabs his food and looks for a place to sit. For Schultz, the lunch scene is a bit overwhelming. He's a recent graduate from Stanford with dark blonde hair and an easy smile. This is his first job out of college. And looking around the cafeteria, he can admit that he feels intimidated to be in a room with so many brilliant people. But Schultz is no stranger to success himself. His grandfather is George Schultz, the former U.S. Secretary of State and now a Theranos board member. It was through his grandfather that Schultz met Elizabeth Holmes and built a relationship that would lead to this job. Schultz walks through the cafeteria, searching for a place to sit. As he gazes across the wide room, it hits him just how confident and comfortable everyone seems to look. Schultz wishes he could say the same for himself. He has a good job working with a team that tests blood samples for specific antibodies, but it's not the team he was hired to work with. On top of that, his supervisor just quit abruptly. According to rumors, she had a fallout with Elizabeth Holmes. There's something that feels chaotic and out of control about Theranos. Schultz sighs as he grabs a seat by himself and starts eating. He shouldn't entertain these kinds of thoughts. Theranos is an exciting company, and his grandfather wouldn't lead him astray. Still, his short time here has left Schultz wondering whether he made the right decision in taking the job. As Schultz works his way through his lunch, the cafeteria suddenly goes quiet. Schultz sets down his fork and looks over his shoulder. Elizabeth Holmes has just entered. She steps onto a raised platform, and right away, a group of employees gather around her. It looks like she has an announcement to make. Surveying the quiet room, Holmes bites her lower lip and tells the employees that they've just opened their first Theranos Wellness Center at the Walgreens in Palo Alto. Holmes is beaming, saying she's proud of every single person in this room. All the hard work, all the sweat, tears, and of course all the blood. It all led to this moment. Every employee should give themselves a round of applause. The cafeteria erupts in cheers, and although he's still new to the company, Schultz joins in, smile forming on his face. Then Holmes begins to tear up and the cafeteria goes quiet once again. Her voice quivering, Holmes begins talking about her uncle, who died from a cancer that could have been prevented if he'd gotten an early warning sign. That's what Theranos is ridding the world of. Holmes's voice rises in passion as she reminds everyone that this is what she's been working for, to prevent these kinds of losses, to be able to hold on to the people in our lives who we love the most. Holmes wipes her eye, and without saying another word, she steps down from the raised platform. The crowd's response is immediate. Employees cheer and applaud, and as Schultz watches this rapturous celebration, he feels something stirring inside him. This mission, this feeling, is why he joined Theranos. Schultz dips his head and smiles. He's aware that he's still young. He'd been scared, uncertain how to make sense of his first days on the job. But after hearing Holmes' speech, he feels restored. It's time to set aside any worries and get to the business of changing the world. Several months later, Tyler Schultz sets down a glass pipette and yawns into his gloved hand. The day has gotten late, but Schultz is still at work in Theranos' lab. And it doesn't look like his work is going to end anytime soon. For hours, Schultz has been standing here, evaluating the accuracy of Theranos' blood testing technology. But no matter what he does, he keeps getting the same problematic results. Schultz squints his eyes in exhaustion. Maybe he's doing something wrong. Everyone says that Theranos has the most cutting-edge technology, so how could he keep failing? But Schultz doesn't know what he can do differently. So he returns to his work, ready to pick up where he left off. But as he reaches for another pipette, Schultz overhears a quiet conversation from across the room. He scoots his chair back and spots the clinical lab team, another work group sharing this space. They're whispering among themselves as they process patient samples. Schultz knows he's supposed to ignore them, but it's late, and with no barrier between them, Schultz can't help but eavesdrop. It sounds like they're talking about Theranos' devices. One person says that they've been flunking quality control tests. Someone else adds that Sonny Balwani, a Theranos executive, has been pressuring him to ignore these failures and just keep running tests. Schultz is shocked. He's heard that Theranos' blood testing devices have been seeing some problems, and he's experienced issues firsthand. But ignoring failures in quality control on real patients' tests, that level of dishonesty is something else entirely. As he debates what to do, Schultz suddenly catches the eye of someone in the clinical lab team. Quickly, he turns back to his lab station, pretending to focus. He hopes he wasn't just caught snooping. But even if he was, there's a bigger issue here. It sounds like there may be something fraudulent happening at Theranos. And if that's true, he has to tell Elizabeth Holmes. As CEO, she has a right to know. It's early 2014, and Elizabeth Holmes is in her office staring at a large calendar on the wall. It's covered with notes about all the big events coming up soon. There's the opening of Theranos wellness centers, clinics hosting the company's blood testing devices. There are partnerships with pharmaceutical companies, and meeting after meeting with investors. Holmes turns away from the calendar, a giant grin on her face. Years ago, she set out to build Theranos into a juggernaut. She wanted to revolutionize medicine, to make a name for herself as a pioneer in the tech industry. And as it stands now, Holmes is on track to achieve those lofty ambitions. Theranos' technology could be in 100 clinics by next year. Holmes has the world's attention. The only thing left to do is fix the remaining issues with the technology itself. And it's not a minor problem, but it is fixable, and Holmes is eager to get past these issues in engineering. As Holmes returns to her desk, she notices Tyler Schultz approaching from the hallway, his dirty blonde hair pushed back. Holmes gathers her thoughts. Schultz recently sent an email that sounded like he was planning to sound an alarm about Theranos' blood testing devices. For any other employee, she would quickly dismiss the concerns and turn to something else more pressing. But Schultz's grandfather sits on Theranos' board, so Holmes has to tread carefully. Holmes waves in Schultz, and he steps into her office. "Hey, Tyler, thanks for stopping by. I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk." "Well, I'm glad to hear that. Here, have a seat." "I read your email. I could tell you were alarmed about something. But I just want to assure you, I have my eye on this entire company. Nothing gets past me, and everything's going to be fine. One thing we cannot do, though, is raise unfounded concerns with the investors or the board. And as we both know, you have a direct line. No, honestly, I wasn't planning to talk with my grandfather or anything. Well, that's the right call. Board members, they're not involved in the day-to-day kinds of stuff that goes on here. It's just not their responsibility. Oh, I understand. But that's not what's on my mind. I wanted to talk to you to tell you about some issues I found. Okay, Tyler? Well, for one thing, there are some very big variations in the test results. Testing people's blood, the results are supposed to be consistently accurate, but these variations have been more than 10%, and that's way more than we claim. Well, I don't know what you mean. We would never make that kind of claim. But we do. Oh, I don't think so. Come over here. Take a look. Schultz approaches the desk, and Holmes clicks over to the Theranos website. As she scrolls through it, Schultz stops her. Look, right there. Coefficient of variation less than 10%. Oh, Tyler, you're not reading the fine print. Look, when you scroll down further, there. That claim refers to our vitamin D test. It's not a blanket promise. Tyler, you've got nothing to worry about. We're not breaking our promises to our partners or our customers. Now, if that's all you wanted to bring up, I'm glad we had the chance to talk, but I do have a very busy day. Holmes starts to usher Schultz to the door, but then he stops. Liz, before I go, I just want to be clear that I'm concerned our company is exaggerating the accuracy of our technology. Tyler, I understand you're concerned, and frankly, that's good. It shows you care. But look, this would take me a long time to walk you through all the intricacies of it, and I don't have the time. Talk with Daniel Young, our VP of Biomathematics. He should be able to clear things up, but look at me. Everything's going to be okay. I promise. Schultz looks like he's about to protest, but then he catches himself and nods. Holmes smiles and takes a deep breath as Schultz exits the office. He was raising serious red flags, and with his grandfather on Theranos' board, this could have been some sort of crisis. Still, Holmes isn't convinced that this is the last she'll hear from Tyler Schultz. So from now on, she'll have to keep a careful eye on her young employee. It's early 2014, and Tyler Schultz is heading down a hallway at Theranos headquarters. He's on his way to a meeting with Daniel Young, the company's head of biomathematics, and the two are planning to discuss Tyler's concerns about Theranos' technology. For Schultz, there's an alarming disconnect between what he sees as an employee and what the rest of the world believes about the company. Whenever he Googles Theranos, he finds euphoric articles claiming that Theranos blood tests are cheaper, faster, and more accurate than conventional technologies. But that's not what Schultz has found working in the lab. So he wants to get some answers, to figure out if his concerns are actually justified. Schultz reaches Young's office and gives a quick knock.
Yeah, come in.
Schultz enters the office where he finds Young sitting at a computer, typing. Tyler, Elizabeth said you had some questions for me. Yes, I do, and thank you for making the time. I'm hoping you can explain some of the weird results I've been seeing. Well, I can't promise that, but I'll try. Go on. Schultz takes out his notepad, which is covered in equations. Oh, I see you've done your homework, Tyler. Well, yeah, I've been looking at our test for syphilis, and when we tested samples that were known to be positive, we were only correct 65% of the time. Now, the number does go up to 80% if we run a second test, but in our reports, we say we're 95% accurate. Oh, can I see? Schultz hands Young his notebook. Oh, yeah, okay, I see what's going on. So you have to understand that sometimes tests are inconclusive, and so those results aren't factored in. And that's the discrepancy in your calculations in the reports. Wait, so inconclusive tests are just thrown out? So our results will look better? Young shifts in his seat, his expression remaining inscrutable. I think you're misunderstanding, Tyler. But we're claiming Theranos' tests aren't just cheaper and faster. We're also saying that they're more accurate than conventional technologies. I mean, that's what we told the Wall Street Journal. But you're saying it's not true. Tyler, that's just Elizabeth. She does some embellishing when she's talking to reporters. And that doesn't concern you at all? Frankly, some of us don't have time to be concerned. Well, do you have the time to be concerned about the proficiency tests? We're running them using other companies' equipment. We're not even reporting results from our own technology. I'm sorry, Tyler, what's the issue? The issue is that it's illegal. It has to be. We're running tests using other people's technology and making it seem like we're actually using Theranos' devices. Now, Tyler, that's just what we have to do right now. Proficiency tests, they require labs to compare their results to their peers. But our devices are cutting edge. We don't have any peers, so we can't use conventional methods. That doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry, but frankly, that's why you're not working on regulatory issues. It's complicated. Now look, I can't offer anything more, so what I think is that you should head back to your desk and focus on what you do best, engineering, biology. If you've got other concerns, though, you know where to find me. Schultz sighs as he looks away. It's no use pressing this any further, so he rises and leaves the office. A few minutes later, Schultz is back at his desk. He's supposed to keep working, but after that meeting with Young, his stomach is in knots. Young is one of the top employees at Theranos, but he's casually dismissing a series of obvious concerns. The company's leaders are not telling the truth about the accuracy of their technology, and if they're willing to lie about something so basic, Schultz can only imagine what else they're hiding. He feels shaken. At first, he doesn't know what to do, but slowly his head grows clear, and Schultz realizes that he has an obligation. It's time to start talking, both to his coworkers and to people outside Theranos. It's March 31st, 2014, in Palo Alto, California. Sunlight peeks through the blinds of a bedroom where everything is silent and still. But suddenly there's a ding announcing the arrival of a new email. Tyler Schultz shoots up in bed and opens his bloodshot eyes. His mouth is hot and his body aches after a long night of tossing and turning. He probably got a few hours of sleep, but that wasn't enough to shake the feeling of panic. Schultz has raised concerns with both Daniel Young and Elizabeth Holmes, and both times he got the sense that they didn't want to hear his warnings. He's afraid that by raising red flags, he could be the next person fired at Theranos. But Schultz is even more afraid of what will happen if he does nothing. He was brought up to do the right thing, and in the case of Theranos, the right thing means protecting innocent patients from a medical technology that is not ready for the public. So Schultz escalated his campaign. He began by setting up an anonymous email account. Then he emailed a director at the New York State Department of Health. In his email, Schultz described how a lab he works at may not have been properly assessing whether its technology actually works. He wanted to get an expert's opinion of the matter. He's been waiting for a reply. Schultz gets out of bed and sits down at his computer. When he checks his inbox, his heart skips a beat. There's a message from Stephanie Schulman, the director at the New York State Department of Health. According to Schulman, Schultz is right. The practices that he described are, in fact, a form of cheating that violates state and federal rules. Schultz has two choices. He can come forward and name the lab that he described, or he can file an anonymous complaint with the state. Schultz's fingers hover over the keyboard. If he goes forward with either of these choices, if he names Theranos in a complaint, he could destroy the company that he works for, and he could humiliate his grandfather, who's one of Elizabeth Holmes' strongest supporters. But if Schultz does nothing, the consequences could be dire for countless people across the country. That's something he can't let happen. So Schultz begins typing. He will file a complaint, and he will blow the whistle on Theranos. It's February 2015, and a Monday morning in Manhattan. John Carreyrou climbs the stairs of a subway station alongside a crush of other commuters. When he steps out into the city streets in Midtown, he's greeted by bumper-to-bumper traffic and crowds of people hurrying into skyscrapers. Carreyrou buttons up his coat, the cold wind blowing through his mop of brown hair. Then he slips into the crowd and begins hurrying to his office in a building that also reaches toward the gray winter sky. Carreyrou has a lot of work ahead of him. For years, he's been a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He's a highly respected journalist, and he's recently finished an investigative piece about Medicare fraud. That story was all-consuming, but now that it's behind him, it's time to get back to work to find his next great feature story. Carreyrou steps into the newsroom of the Wall Street Journal. It's a beautiful, chaotic scene. Reporters type furiously on their keyboards while interviewing sources for their stories. Phones ring in every direction. Up above, flat-screen TVs are tuned to news about the markets and politics. Carreyrou has been in this building 1,000 times, but he'll never get tired of the newsroom, or the important work of holding people in power accountable for their actions. A moment later, Carey-Rue reaches his messy desk. He barely has a chance to take off his coat when his phone rings.
Hello, this is John.
John, it's Adam Clapper. Got a minute?
Adam, good timing. I'm just starting to look for my next story. At some point, I was hoping to talk with my favorite physician/blogger/consultant. You know, you were a huge help for the Medicare series.
Well, it was my pleasure, but I might be the gift that just keeps on giving.
Oh, is that right? What do you got? I'm all ears.
Carey-Rue reaches into his bag and fishes out a notebook and pen. Well, you read the feature in the New Yorker last week? Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos? A pioneer who dreams big, drops out of college, builds a revolutionary piece of technology.
Yeah, it was a compelling story.
But John, didn't you notice? The whole Theranos story is full of holes.
Well, maybe.
John, I think you're as curious about it as I am. What do you think? Talk to me.
Well, there are some pretty big claims there. They don't have any peer-reviewed data.
That's right.
And then Holmes, she studies chemical engineering for just a few semesters, but she's ready to become the next Edison.
Yeah, that bothered me too. So I raised some questions about Theranos on my blog. And wouldn't you know it, a group of people contacted me.
Oh, is that right? Who?
I can't tell you just yet. I gotta check with them first. But they might be willing to talk with you. They've got some information you're gonna want to hear. It could be, it's big.
How big?
John, big.
Carey-Rue pauses, lets the words sink in. Well, but listen, if this is for real and they want to talk, send them my way, please.
Of course. But there's one more thing. Please be delicate with this one. The people I'm connecting with, they're scared. Carey-Rue hangs up and leans back in his chair. More often than not, tips like this don't turn into anything serious. But he trusts Clapper's judgment. And as Carey-Rue turns to his computer and begins researching Elizabeth Holmes, he starts to get that electric tingle of curiosity. This story is different. And if his gut reaction is right, there's something behind Theranos' success. Something dark. By 2015, Elizabeth Holmes had grown to be a celebrity and an icon of the tech industry. She made magazine covers and was heralded as a visionary. President Barack Obama invited her to serve as a global ambassador for entrepreneurship, and Forbes magazine named her the youngest ever self-made female billionaire. Yet for all of the public triumphs, Theranos' blood testing devices were still malfunctioning. That left Holmes and her team scrambling to keep the full truth from the public. This complex web of lies would attract the attention of John Carey-Rue, a dogged journalist. In the course of his investigation, he would speak with whistleblowers who were determined to speak up about their experiences with Theranos. The investigation would reach far and wide, and soon it would pose an existential risk to Elizabeth Holmes' company. It's February 26, 2015, in Manhattan, and John Carey-Rue is clutching his cell phone, ready to make another call. He's already dialed the number a half dozen times without getting an answer, but he knows he needs to keep trying. Because if he gets through, he could uncover a treasure trove of information about Theranos. It's been a busy couple of weeks, ever since Carey-Rue first heard from Adam Clapper, the doctor and blogger. Clapper did eventually connect Carey-Rue with the potential sources, people who'd associated with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. But as Carey-Rue dug into their backstories, he learned that they were tied up in lawsuits with Theranos, making them poor sources for a potential expose. Soon, Carey-Rue learned about another potential source, a man who'd recently quit Theranos after working as the company's lab director. Unlike the others, he wasn't tainted by litigation. And even though Carey-Rue's calls have all gone to voicemail, it's worth trying again. So Carey-Rue lifts his cell phone and dials the source's number. After a few rings, a man's voice answers and Carey-Rue introduces himself. Right away, the man clams up. He says he can't talk. Theranos could sue him if they discovered he was talking to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. Carey-Rue steadies himself and thinks through his response. He's been down this road many times before. Informants are often jittery and afraid of retaliation. But there are ways to earn their trust and to work with them. So Carey-Rue calms his voice, and he says he completely understands. It's normal for whistleblowers to feel scared. There's a lot on the line, but he has an offer. The man can use a pseudonym if he'd like. There's a pause on the other end of the line. Then the man says, fine, he'll speak, but from here on out, he'll take the name Alan Beam. Carey-Rue agrees, and soon Beam starts telling him about his first days at Theranos. Back then, he had large hopes that the company would be revolutionary, that it would transform healthcare. But that changed when Beam learned the truth about Theranos' blood testing device. It was a dud. The device, known as an Edison, often churned out error messages and failed quality control tests. Carey-Rue scribbles notes as fast as he can, his pulse quickening. He can already tell that this is the beginning of a major story. Beam continues, and the information only gets more damaging. He explains that because the Edison devices didn't work, Theranos began to use other companies' equipment. But that created a new problem. Theranos insisted only on drawing a small amount of blood, which was central to the Theranos sales pitch. But if you rely on other companies' machines, you have to use more than just a drop of blood. So the company had to come up with a workaround. Technicians diluted the samples so there was enough liquid to process, but that made the results inaccurate, and sometimes badly so. According to Beam, Theranos was not only misrepresenting what it was doing, but it was reporting test results that could potentially harm patients. Carey-Rue sets down his pen in shock. This kind of deception is unbelievable, and so he asks Beam if he ever tried to intervene. Beam exhales. He explains that he tried to postpone the launch of Theranos' partnership with Walgreens, but Holmes wouldn't do it. Beam also spoke with Sonny Balwani, the chief operating officer, but he was a bully who used intimidation to crush any kind of dissent. Beam's warnings fell on deaf ears. Carey-Rue continues scribbling furiously in his notepad as Beam reveals bombshell after bombshell. After speaking for an hour, the two end their call. As Carey-Rue hangs up, he feels a familiar rush of adrenaline. This isn't just a story about a failed startup. It's bigger than that. Because if what Beam is saying is true, Theranos could be the next Enron. A tale of hubris and deception, one that could end with an incredible downfall. 2 days later, John Carey-Rue steps through a park in Brooklyn, New York. The nearby trees are studded with frost, and Carey-Rue rubs his hands together, trying to stay warm. It's one of the city's coldest Februaries on record, and Carey-Rue should be inside. But he made a promise. He's taking his sons to the park so they can play with their friends. And although his face is numb, Carey-Rue doesn't really mind. He's distracted by more important development in the Theranos investigation. Alan Beam, his confidential source, may soon offer up a cache of incriminating records. While he was still at Theranos, Beam grew concerned that something bad could happen to a patient who used a Theranos blood test, and that he could be held personally responsible. So Beam tried to protect himself. He forwarded dozens of work emails to his personal email account. They included messages to Sonny Balwani, in which he detailed his concerns with Theranos. Carey-Rue was thrilled to learn about these emails. They could be exactly what he needs to help corroborate Beam's incredible accusations. So as he paces around the freezing park in Brooklyn, Carey-Rue decides to give Beam another call to check in. When Beam answers, Carey-Rue cuts to the chase. He's hoping that Beam will send over those old work emails. There's a moment of silence, and then Beam announces that he has some bad news. The emails are gone. He was forced to get rid of them as part of his legal agreement with Theranos. Carey-Rue shakes his head, watching his breath turn to steam. This is a disappointing turn of events. Trying to compose himself, he asks whether Beam double-checked his email's trash or whether he tried contacting his email provider for support. There are often ways to get back old deleted messages. But Beam apologizes and says he's sorry. Those emails are gone. Carey-Rue collapses onto a park bench, trying to think of another plan. They need some way to corroborate his accusations. And so he asks Beam whether he has any other way to get these kinds of damning internal communications. Beam pauses, then says there might be someone worth talking to. A younger guy named Tyler Schultz. His grandfather is George Schultz, the former U.S. Secretary of State and a Theranos board member. Beam doesn't know all the details, but it sounded like Tyler Schultz left the company on bad terms. He might be worth talking to. Carrie-Rue nods, and with his fingers numb from the cold, he takes a note. Tyler Schultz could be a promising lead. He could also be another dead end. It's impossible to know when you're reporting the news. But either way, Carrie-Rue is going to reach out to see what Schultz knows about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. It's the spring of 2015 in Palo Alto, California. In a dark bedroom, Tyler Schultz closes the door and removes a cell phone from his pocket. He turns it over in his hands, marveling at the step he's about to take. The phone is a prepaid burner. Its number is untraceable. And today, Schultz is going to use it to contact an investigative reporter and blow the whistle on Theranos. Schultz dials the number for John Carrie-Rue, his fingers sweating.
Hello, this is John.
Hi, Mr. Carrie-Rue. This is Tyler Schultz. You messaged me on LinkedIn?
Yes, Tyler, hi. I did not think I'd hear from you. That was about a month ago.
Yeah. I don't know. Sorry. I didn't know what to do.
Oh, don't worry. No, I didn't mean to guilt you. I'm just happy you called. Why did you?
Well, I left Theranos only 8 months after coming on board. My parents tried to get me just to walk away, forget about the whole thing, but I don't know. I couldn't.
Huh? Why? What's on your mind?
Schultz gets out of bed and begins pacing the room. Well, Theranos' blood tests, they're just not accurate. What happens if someone actually relies on one of those tests and ends up getting hurt or dying? I just couldn't stop thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a terrible possibility.
A lot of people could suffer, and not just the patients, but everyone in Theranos' orbit, including my grandfather. I mean, he's 94. What happens if he dies and Theranos is exposed and he can't clear his name? That's the last the world ever knows of him.
Well, it sounds to me like you want to help get out the truth before that can happen.
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, I'm with you. You want to go on the record?
Schultz shuts his eyes, feeling anxious and jittery. No, not yet.
Well, but look, I'm sure you've done your research. You know you can trust me. I'm a responsible journalist.
Oh, it's not that. I believe you, yeah. I'm just happy with my life. I've got a new job. I'm doing well. I don't want Theranos coming after me. I mean, Elizabeth Holmes likes to sue people, you know.
Yeah, I've heard that. But Tyler, this can be confidential. I mean, certainly at first. Ultimately, though, I will probably need something on the record if we want to run the story.
For a moment, Schultz weighs the decision. He meant what he said. He doesn't want people to get hurt. But Schultz also doesn't want to upend his own life. But maybe there's a middle way. It's then that Schultz remembers the paper trail. Before he left Theranos, he emailed Elizabeth Holmes, warning her about issues at the company. One day, he printed that email, as well as the company's response, and tucked the pages under his shirt before leaving the office. Schultz has evidence, and he also has his correspondence with the New York Department of Health, in which a state expert suggested that Theranos was cheating. So while Schultz isn't quite ready to be the face of the opposition, he still has plenty that he can share with John Carrie-Rue, and plenty that can put a stop to Theranos. It's the spring of 2015 in Phoenix, Arizona. The door opens inside a Starbucks, and John Carrie-Rue enters, a notebook tucked under his arm. Carrie-Rue breathes in the smell of roasted coffee as he makes his way through the busy shop. It doesn't look like Carrie-Rue's source has arrived, so he orders a cup of coffee and heads over to a quiet table in the corner. As he waits for his interviewee, Carrie-Rue flips through the pages of notes. He's spoken with a number of Theranos' former employees, and altogether, their testimony paints a damaging portrait of the company and its technology. It appears that Theranos is at the center of a major fraud, and with dozens of its wellness centers now operating in storefronts across the country, Theranos is putting patients' lives at risk. Carrie-Rue is almost ready to publish his first story, but before he does, he needs to capture the human toll of Theranos' lies. That's why he's here at this Starbucks. He's about to meet with a woman who relied on one of Theranos' test results and suffered some painful consequences. A few minutes later, the front door of the coffee shop swings open and a perky, middle-aged woman steps inside. Carrie Rue smiles and rises. It's time to meet his newest source. He waves over at Maureen Gluntz, a patient of one of the doctors who Carrie Rue has spoken with. Gluntz approaches the table, and after some small talk, she begins sharing the mortifying details about her experience with Theranos. Gluntz explains that she had some ringing in her ears, so she went to get a blood test from a Theranos machine. When the results came back, she was terribly worried. Theranos reported that Gluntz had elevated levels of liver enzymes and glucose, among other issues. And with the ringing in her ear, her doctor worried that she might be having a stroke, so she went to the ER. Carrie Rue looks up from his notepad, concerned. He asks whether Gluntz is okay. She shakes her head bitterly. She's okay, but that doesn't make her any less angry. She spent hours in the ER, ultimately getting a CT scan and an MRI. They wanted to take every precaution in case it really was a stroke. The doctors also ordered a new round of blood tests, but when those came back, the results were normal, and so were all the other tests. Carrie Rue scribbles down the details in his notebook, then shoots Gluntz a look of sympathy. He apologizes, saying it sounds like she had to go through quite an ordeal, and all because Theranos' test results were inaccurate. Did she have a good insurance plan that might have covered it? Gluntz shakes her head again. She explains that she pays for her own insurance, and her plan has a high deductible. Altogether, she was on the hook for $3,000, all because Theranos' blood tests don't work. Carrie Rue takes a final note and considers the weight of this story. Because of Theranos, Gluntz didn't just endure a frightening health scare. She had to deal with the financial consequences too. And while ultimately she survived, other patients with incorrect test results might not be so lucky. Carrie Rue thanks her for her time. He can feel Gluntz's anger at the inconvenience, at the cost, and the frightening emotional roller coaster Gluntz was put through, all because of an inaccurate test. And while it seems like it's just one person and maybe only $1,000, if you multiply it times the scale of Theranos' ambition, it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. Carrie Rue is ready to publish. His investigation of Theranos will reveal how the Silicon Valley darling is putting people's lives at risk, and how its reckless behavior has to stop. It's July 23, 2015, in Newark, California. A lock turns slowly in a heavy metal door, and when it opens, Elizabeth Holmes stands in the doorway alongside the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. A bright, gleaming light washes over them as the two gaze at what appears to be a state-of-the-art blood testing lab. With a flourish, Holmes welcomes in a small group of people. It includes Biden, his entourage, and local print and TV journalists. Together, they step into a modern-looking space filled with polished equipment and bustling lab technicians. Holmes describes the place as Theranos' newest facility, and when she glances over her shoulder, she can tell that her presentation is already having its desired effect. The vice president seems like he might be enjoying himself. And Holmes is too. Getting a photo op with Joe Biden is a huge deal. And maybe with this tour, he might give Theranos his stamp of approval. And that kind of support couldn't come soon enough. Holmes recently caught wind of a potentially devastating investigation from a reporter named John Carreyrou. He seems to have cultivated a number of inside sources, including Tyler Schultz. Theranos has tried to contain the fallout. Its lawyers have gone after Schultz, threatening to bankrupt him and his family as punishment for speaking with the reporter. The legal team has also gone after another former employee, as well as multiple doctors who Carreyrou has spoken with. And it's not just legal action Theranos is planning. With its technology still far from perfect, Holmes had to do something to shore up Theranos' reputation. That's why the tour today is so important. Biden's support could help blunt any future attacks and make Theranos more immune to criticism. So Holmes continues the tour, showing off a range of high-tech equipment. It all seems to be going well, until she catches one of Biden's aides staring at a stack of Theranos devices. Holmes' heart skips a beat. She wonders if this aide is an expert in clinical labs. Maybe his trained eye could figure out what's going on here. Because the truth is, the lab is a fake. It was created just for the vice president's tour. And that's not the only thing that's wrong. Theranos doesn't even have a real lab director. They replaced Alan Beam with a figurehead, a dermatologist with very little lab experience. Her concern growing, Holmes decides it's time for another captivating presentation, something to distract her guests from the fake lab. And so as they continue the tour, she employs her usual soaring language. She explains that this lab is state-of-the-art, that Theranos is on the forefront of a medical revolution, one that will lower the cost of care and provide medical services to millions. The vice president narrows his eyes as he surveys the lab. For a moment, Holmes feels panicked. It's hard to tell what Biden is thinking. Maybe he can sniff out the ruse too. But then Biden turns back with a big grin. He says he's very impressed. Theranos is clearly the future of medicine. Hearing Biden's praise, Holmes melts with relief. Finally, a small victory after so many hurdles. The vice president's approval will do a lot to bolster her public image. And with any luck, it'll help her turn the tide. But Holmes knows the work doesn't end there. If Theranos is going to survive the scrutiny of the press and John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal, she'll have to do more to win over the public's opinion and prove that Theranos is here to stay. 5 days later, John Carreyrou steps into the newsroom of the Wall Street Journal in Manhattan. He sets down his briefcase, grabs a cup of coffee, and starts paging through today's edition of the Journal. As far as he's concerned, it's the very best way to start the morning. But as his eyes scan the paper's first section, he stops. There, prominently placed in his own newspaper, is an op-ed written by none other than Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes. In it, she boasts that the FDA has recently approved a Theranos test for herpes. Her article makes it sound like Theranos is an ally of government regulators. Carreyrou stares at the article in disgust. This is an obvious ploy and a clever act of war. At the Wall Street Journal, there's a clear boundary between the editorial division and the news division. The editorial staff have no idea that Carreyrou is working on a big investigative piece about Theranos. And Holmes seems to have taken advantage of the situation. Her article makes her look like a saint in one of the most respected papers in the country. It's an obvious PR maneuver, one that seems intent to set up a defense and pressured the paper to not publish Carreyrou's story. With this morning's paper in hand, Carreyrou hurries to the office of his editor, Mike Cicchinolfi. Carreyrou steps into his editor's office and comes face to face with Cicchinolfi, a slim, bookish man with a wave of dark hair.
Hey, Mike, you got a minute? Not really. I'm on deadline. I'm sorry, but this can't wait.
His editor stops and exhales as he looks up.
All right, John, what's going on? You see the paper this morning? John, I see the paper every morning. Well, did you see this?
Carreyrou opens the paper to Holmes' op-ed and hands it across the table.
No. God, I missed this. Yeah, and that's not all. She recently gave a lab tour to Joe Biden. Apparently it was very well received. Public relations coup. Yeah, no kidding.
Carreyrou leans forward with a determined look.
Listen, Mike, my story's done. I filed my draft a week ago. We have to move on it, because right now, as we speak, Theranos is intimidating my sources. They're trying to crush this story. They're building a PR defense. We have to beat them to the punch. Well, no, it's an explosive story. And that's why it has to go through the usual process. We need to make it bulletproof. Mike, it's too slow. No, it's the way it's going to be. I haven't even finished my edits. Then it goes to page 1 and standards and legal. You know they need to go through it too. That could take months. In the meantime, Theranos could get all my sources to turn. The story could fall apart. You know it.
Cicchinolfi leans back in his chair with a sly grin.
John, I need to remind you about La Matanza, the ancient ritual, the fishermen with their spears in the Mediterranean, standing there for hours perfectly still, waiting. So still and so long that the fish don't even realize the hunters are still there. And it's at that moment the fishermen strike. Jesus, Mike, La Matanza every time. That's how we win. La Matanza is how we win. We wait until all the pieces fall into place and Theranos has forgotten about us. And then we strike.
Carreyrou shakes his head.
All right, fine. But look,
La Matanza has to happen before October 21st. Why, what's that? Elizabeth Holmes is slated to give a talk at the Journal's technology conference in Laguna Beach. Man, if that happens, the paper's going to feel a lot of pressure to kill the story. Well, it's over 2 months away. So we just got to get back to work. We'll break this thing. I promise. Carey-Rue nods and walks out of his editor's office. This isn't ideal. He's still worried that Theranos will somehow get ahead of him, find a way to sink the story. But that just means Carey-Rue needs to keep pushing forward, finding more sources, uncovering more lies, and working on the fullest version of the story that will expose Theranos. It's late September 2015, and Elizabeth Holmes is hurrying through a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. The towering building houses News Corporation, the global media conglomerate and one of the most powerful companies in America. News Corp also happens to be the parent company of the Wall Street Journal. That's why Holmes is here today. She's on her way to a meeting with News Corp's leader, Rupert Murdoch. Holmes met the media mogul back in 2014 at a gala in Silicon Valley. She made a quick impression on Murdoch and convinced him to invest $125 million in Theranos. That made him the company's largest investor. The two have met several times since, and with Murdoch's sizable investment in Theranos, Holmes believes he may be willing to pull the plug on the Wall Street Journal's investigation of her company. It's in his own self-interest. Soon, Holmes reaches the outside of a large office, and then an assistant leads Holmes into a large room with wide windows. Standing in the center is Rupert Murdoch, the aging media titan. Holmes and Murdoch are on good terms, and so he greets her warmly, asking how things are going. But Holmes hesitates. Part of her wonders if she's making the right decision, trying to get Murdoch to intervene in one of his newspaper stories. It's a serious request, and the last thing she needs is to give a prominent investor reason to doubt Theranos. But Carey-Rue's investigation could soon be published and tarnish Theranos' image. The threat is too real and too imminent, so Holmes can't risk taking a soft approach. She tells Murdoch that she has a problem. A Wall Street Journal reporter, John Carey-Rue, has collected false information from disgruntled former employees. He has a notebook full of lies, but given his reputation, he could do serious damage if his story is published. Murdoch nods, saying he understands Holmes's plight. He went through his own scandal a few years back and was dragged through the mud by reporters. It's a bitter fight, but he survived, and she will too. Holmes swallows hard and repeats her concerns. She argues that Carey-Rue's false reporting poses an enormous threat. The story has to be killed. Murdoch has the power to make the right decision. But Murdoch shakes his head. He says he trusts his editors to do their jobs. He's not going to intervene. Then, with a pat on Holmes' shoulder, he tells her that everything is going to work out. She just needs to have faith. Holmes manages to muster a smile, but inside, she's seized by a feeling of complete terror. Theranos has tried to silence its former employees. They've tried to get ahead of the Wall Street Journal, to sabotage the reporting. But somehow Holmes and her allies weren't able to put out the fire. Murdoch was her last option to put an end to the Wall Street Journal story. Theranos' secrets are about to become public. It's October 8th, 2015, in Manhattan. An elevator door opens, and John Carey-Rue steps out onto the sixth-floor newsroom of the Wall Street Journal. Beside him is Jerry Baker, the paper's editor-in-chief. As they walk toward a conference room, the two veteran journalists share a knowing glance. They're about to sit down with Theranos' legal team in a meeting that could produce fireworks. The Journal is on the verge of publishing Carey-Rue's investigation of Theranos, and despite all the company's best efforts, including legal threats and intimidation of sources, the storied newspaper doesn't have any intention to cave. Theranos threatened to sue the Wall Street Journal and demanded a meeting with the editors. Baker, the editor-in-chief, believes in fairness, and so he granted the request. This is the meeting they agreed to. Carey-Rue and Baker enter the conference room, where they find several stone-faced lawyers. One of them is Heather King, who sets a tape recorder on the table. I hope you don't mind, but I brought a tape recorder because we keep diligent records, unlike some of you in this room. Carrie-Rue raises his eyebrows as he takes a seat. All right, well, we're off to a good start. Miss King, what would you like to discuss? We're here because we have a duty to prevent Miss Holmes and her company from suffering grievous harm, and we have a duty to get the truth to the public. But you failed in that responsibility. Miss King, I have to disagree. Mr. Carrie-Rue, your reporting is reckless. You're more interested in a good piece of drama than the facts. Drama. Yeah. Look, I've done my reporting, and I've only followed the facts. You're going to deny them all? There's nothing you're willing to concede? No, there is. We will admit that the company has not run all of its blood tests on Theranos devices. Employees have used third-party technology. Oh, okay. Well, that explains why you took that line off your webpage. The lawyers exchange confused looks. I'm sorry, what are you talking about? The Theranos webpage. It used to say, many of our tests require only a small drop of blood. That's verbatim. It used to be on the website, and now it's not. Because, from what I've learned, when Theranos uses these other companies' machines, they need more than a small drop of blood. And that's why test results have been false. Mr. Carrie-Rue, that deletion, I assure you, was just for marketing accuracy. Suddenly, the room gets tense. Carrie-Rue can tell that King has made a gaffe, admitting Theranos can no longer stand by its most coveted claim that its tests only depend on a single drop of blood. Gentlemen, look, this talk is just going in circles. The truth is, we're not here to kill your article. We'd simply like you to push it back. I'm sorry. We can run it, but you want us to delay it. Yes, not indefinitely, just long enough so we can arrange a demonstration, proof that our technology works. Well, how soon could we get a demo? And some assurance that there wouldn't be any sleight of hand. I promise you it would be entirely above board. But it might take us a few weeks to organize. What do you say to that? Just a few weeks? Carrie-Rue exchanged glances with his editor-in-chief. Holmes is set to appear at the Wall Street Journal's tech conference in less than 2 weeks. This would put the story at risk. So Baker, the editor-in-chief, shakes his head and says he's sorry. The paper is willing to push back publication a few days, but only if Elizabeth Holmes is willing to sit down for an interview. Otherwise, they're going to print. The room is silent as the lawyers exchange looks. Then they nod, gather their belongings, and walk out. It takes a moment to sink in, but then the truth hits Carrie-Rue. This meeting was a victory. Theranos didn't have any other trick up its sleeve, and in a matter of days, the entire world will know the truth. 8 days later, the skies in Palo Alto are blanketed with clouds. Inside Theranos' headquarters, Elizabeth Holmes walks by herself, surveying the empty office. She studies the expensive furniture, the sleek design, everything intended to make Theranos look like a Silicon Valley dream. But it's a dream that's now been shattered. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal published its exposé from the journalist John Carrie-Rue. The article made devastating accusations, accusing Theranos of lies and criminality. When Holmes read the story, she was awash in shame and humiliation, kinds of feelings she thought she'd outgrown. She was supposed to be an incredible success, a pioneer like Steve Jobs who would change the world. And for a brief flicker of time, it seemed like Holmes had achieved her wildest ambitions. She made the covers of magazines, befriended global leaders, made herself into a billionaire. But now it's all come crashing down, and she has to face this very ugly and public spectacle. Her employees have gathered in the company cafeteria, and in a minute, Holmes is going to have to try to explain what exactly happened. If she's a good enough leader, maybe she'll convince them to stay, to remain believers in her vision. A moment later, Holmes reaches the doors of the cafeteria and takes a deep breath. Then she steps through. All eyes turn to her as Holmes enters the cool, dimly lit room. She puts on a steely expression and steps onto the stage. Holmes begins by greeting her team. She acknowledges that by this point everyone has seen the news, and there's something she has to say. But before she goes on, she pauses. All at once it's clear. Her employees don't look angry. They look terrified. They need this company, and they need Holmes to be strong. She has a moment of emotional clarity. It's not time to fold. It's not time to surrender. Not now, when they've come so far. So Holmes straightens her back and tells her employees that the article in the Wall Street Journal may be explosive, but it's full of lies, misinformation spread by bitter ex-employees. Holmes shakes her head. She says this sort of thing is bound to happen when you're working to change the world. Apple faced this kind of opposition, so too did Google. Now it's Theranos' time in this excruciating spotlight. Holmes tells her employees to remember the name John Carreyrou, the journalist who tried to smear them all. But Theranos isn't done. They won't be taken down by a desperate man looking for a good quote. They're stronger than that. They're smarter, better, and they will prevail. Holmes then steps down from the stage as slowly, like a wave cresting over the ocean, her employees begin to chant. As Holmes leaves the cafeteria, her employees are cursing the journalist John Carreyrou over and over, getting louder, more boisterous, and united in fury. The employees have taken her side. They won't be beaten down by John Carreyrou or his hatchet job. And this is not the end of Theranos. Far from it. For Elizabeth Holmes, this is a new beginning. Elizabeth Holmes did not back down in the face of John Carreyrou's accusations. She publicly fought back against the investigation, claiming that Carreyrou's reporting was inaccurate and that his sources, including former employees, were badly mistaken. But it wasn't enough to protect Theranos. In November 2016, Walgreens sued the company, seeking the return of their $140 million investment. In June 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani in what the agency described as an elaborate, years-long fraud. Facing multiple federal and civil suits, Theranos dissolved later that year. September 8, 2021, marked the first day of Elizabeth Holmes' federal criminal trial. She and Sunny Balwani were both charged with wire fraud. Holmes' lawyers argued that while Theranos failed as a business, Holmes is innocent of fraud. This episode was produced while the trial was still ongoing. Holmes was once heralded as a maverick, a powerful female entrepreneur in the male-dominated world of tech, and her company Theranos promised that it would revolutionize medicine. Yet Holmes' downfall helped shine a light on one of the dark sides of Silicon Valley, where exaggeration, overpromises, and a good story can be worth billions, even if that story rests on a foundation of lies. In the mid-2010s, Theranos grew into one of the most celebrated companies in Silicon Valley. Founded by the young entrepreneur Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos promised a revolution in medicine. The company would offer inexpensive blood tests for a variety of health conditions. These tests would only require a few drops of blood, and with their availability in stores like Walgreens, millions of Americans would gain easy access to vital information about their health. It was a grand vision, but Theranos would never make good on this promise. The Wall Street Journal published a searing expose revealing problems with the company's technology and leadership. The article would ultimately destroy Theranos and lead to criminal charges against Elizabeth Holmes. Theranos became a national sensation, exposing a dark side of Silicon Valley, where companies often abide by a fake-it-till-you-make-it mentality. It's a strategy that can help court investors, but it's also led some to wonder whether the tech industry needs to fundamentally change. My guest today is Charles Duhigg, an investigative journalist and the best-selling author of The Power of Habit, which explores how we can change our lives by changing our habits. He's also the author of Smarter, Faster, Better. As a reporter, Duhigg was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2013 for a series that looked at the global problems with the tech industry. Before becoming a reporter, Duhigg worked in private equity. In our conversation, we'll look at how venture capitalists often work to create monopolies, even when the companies themselves might be troubled. And we'll discuss whether these powerful investors are ultimately responsible for failures at companies like Theranos. Our conversation is next. Charles Duhigg, welcome to American Scandal.
Thanks for having me.
We've all heard about venture capitalists and how their money has helped fund the growth of tech giants like Uber, Facebook, and quite a few others. But let's start at the basics. What is venture capital and how does it work?
So venture capital is any time that a group of pretty rich people, for the most part, get together and they hand some cash to a young company and say, we're going to take a stake in your company. We're going to take some of your stock, and we're going to give you the money that you need to grow and to become the firm that you want to be. Now, what's interesting about venture capital is it hasn't actually been around that long, right? There's always been investors in companies, but as an organized activity, it really started basically back in the 1940s when a professor at Harvard Business School discovered that some of his colleagues over at MIT had this idea for a new kind of medical technology. And so he got together some of his friends and he said, look, we'll give you some money and some advice because you're all scientists and we're all smart business people. We'll give you some advice and give us a stake in the company. And if you do well, we'll all get rich.
So that's how it's perhaps different from any other financing like debt or a loan.
Exactly. So debt or a loan is literally a bank saying, we're going to give you some money. You don't give us any stock in return, but you have to pay us back what we gave you plus some interest. And debt or a loan is the safest kind of investment you can make, right? If that company ends up going bankrupt and they have to sell off all of their assets, the people who gave them debt, they get paid first. Now, standing behind those people who gave them debt, the bank, are the venture capitalists, the people who gave them money and said, you don't have to pay this money back, but you do have to give us some stock in your company. And that way we own a part of the company. And by the way, if your company does well, if you have lots of profits, then we also have the right to demand some of those profits.
It's interesting that you say one of the earliest examples of venture capitalism was investment in a medical technology company, because this series just looked at Theranos. Why are venture capitalists so often associated with technology? Are they only designed for that kind of business?
Not necessarily, but I went to Harvard Business School. And when I was at HBS, we learned the Willie Sutton rule. Willie Sutton was a great bank robber, one of the most successful bank robbers. And when eventually he got caught, a reporter came up to him and they said, Willie, why do you rob banks? And Willie said, well, because that's where the money is. And that's why venture capital is investing in tech right now. And for the last 20 years or so, right? It's not that technology is something special, that venture capitalists didn't invest in other things. In fact, there's lots of venture capitalists who invest in all kinds of other things, and in manufacturing companies and supply chain companies. But most of the VC dollars that we're aware of are going to tech. And that's because tech is the fastest growing industry. It's where the money is. Not only that, but the thing that we know about technology, at least as the industry is constructed right now, is that you can get these economies of scale, right? You give someone $1 million and they build Facebook, and suddenly Facebook is worth $5 billion. They don't have to hire a bunch of people. There's also some historical precedent here, which is that the birth of the tech industry, as we think about it, the birth of Silicon Valley was rooted in venture capitalism. When Hewlett-Packard started, which was one of the original tech companies that really created Silicon Valley, they were backed by a small group of venture capitalists. When Stanford decided to start really growing aggressively to become a powerhouse university, one of the things that they did is they really put a lot of money into venture capital in the Silicon Valley area. And the thing that they build in Silicon Valley is they build tech. And so since essentially the origins of the contemporary technology industry, venture capital has grown up alongside it because that's where the money is.
Well, it sounds like venture capitalists then have pretty much fundamentally changed the business landscape in the last 60, 80 years.
What they've done is they've definitely created a new source of capital for companies, right? They have supercharged the ability to create new companies and start new companies. You know, if you were to go back to the 1950s or 60s, starting a new company was like a big deal, right? It was like you had to go find the money and you had to convince other people to join you. And it was a big risky thing. Most people worked for IBM or they worked for Hewlett-Packard. It was the rebels who would go off and start firms. Nowadays, to start a company, all you really need to do is know how to put together a PowerPoint deck with 4 or 5 slides and promise that you're going to make $5 billion someday. And so you're right. Venture capital has made it much easier to start new companies, in part because venture capital has gone from being this small little thing to being a huge asset class with billions and billions of dollars to give away every year.
You make it sound like it's almost free money.
I mean, for some companies, it is free money, right? At least at first. The problem is that there is no such thing as a free lunch or free money over the long term. And so when you work with venture capitalists, you are definitely giving something up. You're giving up equity. Oftentimes you're giving up control. You're giving up the ability to determine your fate. Now that started shifting in the last couple of years, particularly among these sort of high-flying entrepreneurs and who seem like they have unicorn dust on them. Traditionally, venture capitalists were in charge, right? They were the guys, and some gals, but they're mostly guys. They were the guys with the wallets who had the cash, so they could call the rules. But what's happened in the last decade in particular, as there's been so much growth, so much economic prosperity, is that so much money has flooded into venture capital that they're now desperate to give their money away. And that's empowered entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs can now make demands of venture capitalists that they couldn't make previously. They get to pick and choose who they're going to allow to invest in their companies. And as a result, the power dynamic has shifted. Another important shift that's occurred is that venture capitalists used to be the adults in the rooms, right? So there was this one early venture capitalist named Tom Perkins, who was a famous venture capitalist who, helped build 60 or 70 companies. He's one of the founders of Kleiner Perkins, which is one of the best known venture capital firms from the last wave of tech. And Perkins would go in and he would actually get really involved in these companies, right? He would invest in a company. He would show up at their offices one day a week and he would hold people's feet to the fire. He would ask them, how much are you spending? Show me your budgets. Prove to me that you're making good choices. He brought what's known as good governance to firms. He was really involved in the companies that he funded. And this was true of venture capitalists throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Venture capitalists were the adults in the room. And then this dynamic that I mentioned before, when all of a sudden there's so much more venture capital money, now suddenly entrepreneurs can start calling the shots. They're in charge because they can say, I'm going to let you invest in my company. One of the demands that entrepreneurs had was to say, look, if I'm going to let you invest in my company, I don't want you sticking your nose in here. I don't want you telling me what to do. In fact, I want you to give me enough power so that I have a super voting authority on my board. You can't rein me in even if you want to. And I think many people would argue that has been a change not for the better.
Was this the issue at play with Theranos? Elizabeth Holmes managed to raise a lot of money from investors while maintaining a tight grip over her company.
I don't know the Theranos story very well. I've never reported on Theranos. But just from reading the coverage, what I do know is my understanding is that Elizabeth Holmes and others went to mainstream venture capitalists, and that particularly in the biotech space, right? People who know that space really well, people who know the blood technology space particularly well, and that those folks started doing their due diligence. They started asking things like, can you give me proof that your technology works? How many peer-reviewed published papers do you have about this technology where other scientists are objectively evaluating it and determining whether it lives up to its promise? And whatever those established venture capitalists heard, it made them decide not to back this company, right? The people who backed Theranos are like Rupert Murdoch, who knows media really, really well, but as far as I know, doesn't know much about biotech. Betsy DeVos, right? Betsy DeVos didn't even earn her own money. She inherited it from people who started Amway, a door-to-door sales company. She was the education secretary under Donald Trump. So I don't think that she has a degree in biotech. Maybe she's an expert in biotech, but as far as I know, she isn't. So my guess is that those people were just in a position where they really weren't qualified to do due diligence, and they didn't reach out to ask people who knew how to do due diligence on biotech to evaluate this investment before they handed over their money.
Let's investigate perhaps the reason why there's so much money coming into venture capitalism, because it should still be an industry of some fundamentals, and that is a return on investment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the reason why so much money has come in is that during various periods, venture capital has provided huge returns, right? The venture capital model is kind of a strange one because if I'm starting a venture capital firm, I know that I'm going to make, let's say, 20 investments. And I believe going in, before I've even hung up my shingle, I believe that 18 of those investments are going to go belly up. They're going to declare bankruptcy. They're going to fail. Something's going to happen. They're going to be bad investments. But one or two of them is going to be successes. And they're not just going to be successes. They are going to be monster successes, right? I'm going to put in $2 million and 10 years later or 7 years later, my $2 million is going to be worth $1 billion. And so it's going to make up for all the losses and all the other investments that I made that didn't work out. And for a long time, that logic was a pretty good logic because it worked again and again and again, right? You put a couple of $1 million into Facebook and Facebook becomes the biggest thing on earth. A guy named Masa-san, who runs a big venture capital fund called the Vision Fund, he makes a series of investments during the first tech boom, most of which are terrible, most of which go bankrupt when the economy turns. But he put a couple of $1 million into a firm named Alibaba, and those couple of $1 million end up being worth something like 30 or 40 billion dollars by the time Alibaba becomes a giant. And so that has been the logic for a long time is I'm going to make a bunch of bets. Most of them aren't going to work out, but some of them are. And when they do, they're going to knock it out of the park. And so as a result, a lot of people standing on the sidelines, pension funds, endowment funds, particularly people who listen to a guy named David Swanson, who ran the endowment fund at Yale, who was very, very enthusiastic about alternative investments, about private equity and venture capital as a category of private equity. They said, look, I'm going to start reallocating my money out of stocks because the problem with stocks is it's hard to get an outsized return. I'm definitely not going to be putting it into bonds, right? Because interest rates have been low now for over a decade. I'm going to put it into venture capital because venture capital seems to be giving me higher returns. The problem with every asset class, though, is that when capital starts flooding in, usually returns go down. And that's what's happened with VC.
It sounds like when you're chasing the home run, like venture capitalists do, there's a lot of incentive to not miss, so you might find yourself in some sort of gambler's fallacy, thinking that and pouring good money after bad. What's the danger there?
Well, exactly as you said, one thing that can happen is that venture capitalists will have put money into a company and they'll be so committed to wanting to see that payoff occur that they'll pour more and more money in. But the other thing that's happened is that there has been this theory that has emerged known as blitzscaling, primarily within the tech industry. And it has its roots in some very sound logic. I was talking to one venture capitalist and he was talking about Uber. And he said, we were early investors in Uber. And as soon as it became clear that Uber was going to be a success, there were 15 Uber competitors. And so the only way that we could protect our investment in Uber was to get Uber as big as possible, as fast as possible. And the only way to do that was to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into it so it could scale at a breakneck pace. That's blitzscaling, right? And it's true. One of the things about the internet economy and the economy today is that it is this winner-take-all economy, right? There's only one Amazon. There's only one Uber. Lyft is a little bit of a competitor, but even in that case, they're smaller and there's only two of them. And so this blitzscaling to get as big as fast as possible requires huge amounts of infusion of capital. And that's what the venture capitalists support is there's no way that a company can earn enough money to grow that quickly. They need to go to outside investors and venture capitalists are on board. So if I've invested $5 million in this firm and it says we want to become the biggest firm on earth and we need another 500 million to do that, then as a venture capitalist, it makes sense to me to give them 500 million. Not only that, but if I'm a venture capitalist, I just raised $1 billion fund or a $1.5 billion fund. I got to put that money to work because I don't get paid until I put that money out the door. So when one of my investments comes to me and says, we need $500 million more, even though you only gave us 5 million last time, I'm not unhappy to hear that suggestion because I got 500 million burning a hole in my pocket. And if I can invest it in one company instead of trying to invest it in 10 companies, that means less work for me.
Blitzscaling sounds like an attractive strategy if you're certain your company is a winner. It makes an instant monopoly in the market niche that this company is operating in. But what if the company you're investing in isn't a winner? What happens when it's a bad venture?
Well, I mean, I've never met an entrepreneur who tells me that their company isn't a winner, right? Like if you're the kind of guy who says, or the kind of gal who says, "Hey, you know what? I started this company, and I don't know, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't." You're not doing well in Silicon Valley. You're not even in the office of a venture capitalist. You know, you've gone to the Y Combinator or some other place that's taught you to say, the reason I'm starting this company is because it can change the world. If we can just sell pieces of chicken faster and more efficiently, then peace will break out all over, right? That's ingredient number one, is to say that you're going to change the world. But ingredient number two is to say, and by next year, we will have 95% of the world eating our chicken. Nobody ever comes in and says, you know, this company, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. They all pretend, or maybe even believe, that they're building the most successful company on the face of the planet.
Well, yeah, that's the entrepreneur's pitch. And probably the venture capitalist believes it to make the initial investment. But after that initial investment has been made, and even though the venture capitalist knows that 18 out of 20 of his gambles are going to fail, what if all 20 of them do? There's got to be incentive to continue propping up what was thought to be the winner.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. When you're deep into a company, there's this old saying, right? If you borrow $1 million from the bank owns you. If you borrow $100 million from the bank, you own the bank. And that's exactly what happens, is that venture capitalists very often will make one investment, and then the entrepreneur will come back and they'll ask for more money, and they say, nah, I don't think you guys have lived up to the promise. I don't think you're the winner that I thought you were. And they cut them off. And that happens a lot. And it's usually disastrous for that entrepreneur or for that company when it happens. The other alternative is that sometimes you invest $1 million, then you invest $5 million, then you invest $10 million, and then they come back to you and they say, we need more money now. And you're thinking to yourself, gosh, they're not really hitting their marks, right? They're not really performing the way that I thought that. But I can't write down $16 million investment at this point. The only thing I can do is give them another $20 million and hope that they'll have enough cash to figure it out and become the winner that I hoped they were in the first place. This is, I mentioned before, Masasan and Vision Fund. This is what Vision Fund has done again and again and again. WeWork is one of the best examples. WeWork seemed like it was sputtering. Things were falling apart. But Masasan and Vision Fund had invested so much money into WeWork already that the only thing they could do was give them more money in the hopes that they can turn it around and figure it out. Because otherwise, he has to tell his investors, I just lost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for you.
Tell me how today's VC deals are structured. It's probably not just one person anymore. These are big firms. It's an established business.
Yeah, it is a big business. But I mean, that being said, there's usually one person inside a venture capital fund who is responsible for a particular investment, right? They're the person who's kind of leading the investment. And then what will happen after that is, if it's a big investment, like let's say the Charles Duhigg Venture Capital Fund is going to put some money into Company X, and Company X wants to raise $100 million. So I become the lead investor, and Charles Duhigg, I'm the guy inside the fund who's really going to be like running herd on this, right? Like I'm in charge of it. So I'm doing all the work. I'm negotiating all the deals. I'm going to go to other venture capital funds and I'm going to say, look, I'm putting in $10 million. I'm going to be the lead investor. If you want to come in, I'm going to create some space for you. You can put in 5 million, or you can put in 2 million, or you can put in 8 million. I'm going to syndicate out this round. And I'm going to let other venture capitalists participate with me. Now, the reason why I would do that is because, number one, $100 million is a pretty big risk for me to take on my own, right? I want to spread the risk around. But also, I know that if I cut you in on this deal, somewhere down the road, you're going to cut me in on one of your deals. And so that way, I don't have to look for every single great deal and elbow my way into it. I'm going to get invited in by the syndicate that I belong to. And at this point, there's really just about 10 to 15 venture capital funds. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of venture capital funds in the world. But there's only about 10 to 15 of them that do the by far majority of the deals, right? These are the funds that control the venture capital industry. And one of the ways that they preserve that authority is, first of all, they have a lot of money. But second of all, they tend to syndicate with each other. They work together as a pack in order to determine which companies get in and to sometimes keep upstarts out.
We've mentioned here that the pitch for any aspiring business is that they're going to change the world. That it's not just the bottom line, it's an aspiration for the betterment of humanity. That's the entrepreneur's side. But on the venture capitalist side, do they have a mission? Is it just earn profits, or is there something larger at hand?
I mean, even guys who just want to earn profits, they never just say, I just want to earn profits, right? The greediest person on the face of the planet will still tell you that they're in it because they really wanted to be Mother Teresa. It just so happens that they became a billionaire in the process. Yeah, venture capitalists, if you talk to them, they'll tell you they got into this because they love technology. They believe technology will change the world. They want to find and encourage the companies of tomorrow that are going to make the world a better place. And, you know, a lot of them are being honest and truthful. I have a lot of friends who are venture capitalists, and they're really great people, right? They believe deeply in what they're doing. They're fascinated by new technology. They really want to help entrepreneurs reach their potential. Now, at the same time, they also don't mind getting insanely rich. And the fact that they're able to, buy a Gulf Stream in addition to, cure cancer, hey, it's a great world.
Some people might look at venture capitalism and see the potential for a troubling system. It seems like you've got this syndicate of self-dealing billionaires, probably more self-interested than they let on to be, with an overabundance of capital that they need to spend, giving bright-eyed, bushy-tailed entrepreneurs too much control. Is that a fair criticism, you think?
Yeah, there's excesses, but what you just described is like the recipe for a fantastic economy, right? Like the whole point of particularly American capitalism is it's supposed to be easy to start new companies. And it's supposed to be easy to walk away when it's not working and start and try something new. Like, yeah, it's bad when it gets too concentrated, right? When there's gatekeepers who start preventing good ideas from getting executed on, when people who are clearly crazy and shouldn't be running companies are given a ton of money for bad ideas, all of that is distortive. But excesses are part of capitalism. Like, there's no way to design an economy that does not have excesses in it if it has free enterprise and competition. Like the system that we have, because at this moment in time, there is too much money, there is too little regulation, there's, basically we've had 12, 13 years now of unchecked growth. And so there are these excesses that you can point at and say, like, this is going off the rails. That's all true. But the basic system itself is a great system. Like asking people to take on risk, to vote with their dollars on what they think is going to win or lose. That's much better than the alternatives, which would be the government making bets on who ought to win or lose, or being in a situation where there's such little capital, everyone's so risk averse that if I have a great idea, I can't get any funding for it. And that's happened in the past. That still happens right now to some groups, right? African Americans have a much harder time raising capital, and that's disastrous for the economy. It's disastrous for those communities. It's disastrous for all of us. So I don't think you can argue that the system itself is flawed. It's just that it has some excesses right now. I also want to, because I know that you guys are talking about Theranos. The important thing about Theranos is mainstream venture capitalists did not invest in Theranos. It was individuals who are not professional VCs who gave Theranos its money. It was these like sort of fringe figures who were rich, but weren't in the habit of making bets on companies that supported what happened at Theranos. Like Theranos, in many ways, you can point to as something that's proof that the VC system actually works, because all of the establishment VCs, they all passed on Theranos.
You mentioned earlier that there might be a lack of regulation in the venture capital industry. What sort of regulations are there, and what are the responsibilities of venture capitalists to the public and to the companies that they invest in?
So probably the biggest regulation, and this isn't just for venture capital. This is true for essentially all kinds of private equity investments, right? When you're buying securities, stock in a company that's not a publicly traded company, the first thing is you have to be what's known as a qualified investor, which means that you basically have to be rich. You have to earn a certain amount of money each year. You have to have a certain amount of money in savings, excluding the value of your house. So basically, the government has said, unless you're rich to begin with, you can't do this kind of investing. And the reason why they say that is because they say, look, if you are rich, we assume that you're financially savvy. So we're going to let you take more risks. Now, for the venture capitalist, assuming that they raise all their money from qualified investors, then when a venture capitalist invests in a company, oftentimes they ask for in return a board seat, right? They join the board of directors, and maybe they'll get 1 or 2 seats, or maybe they won't get any. But if they join the board, that's really important, because when you're on the board, you're the ultimate bosses of that company. The board can hire and fire the CEO in most cases. The board is where the buck stops. Now, there are some rules about what responsibilities you have if you serve on a board. The biggest rule is that you have essentially a fiduciary interest to all the shareholders and not just yourself. So if, for instance, I'm on the board of a company and I learn about a takeover offer that would make me personally rich, but would screw all the minor investors, all the employees, all the other people who have bought small pieces of stock in this company, I have an obligation to say no to that deal, to protect the minority investors who are not on the board, because I represent the shareholders. I don't just represent myself. So one of the things that has been a criticism of venture-backed companies is that venture capitalists will get on the boards of these companies and they will act in their own self-interest rather than the interest of all of the shareholders. Again, WeWork is the perfect example of this. So when WeWork was blowing up, there was a deal that was put on the table that would have paid off all of the board members, that would have made all of the big venture capitalists essentially given them a return on their investment, and would have screwed all of the minority shareholders, people like the employees who had stock. Now, there are some who would argue, and I think this is a very powerful and legitimate argument, that the board of directors, these venture capitalists who are on the board, they should have said no to that deal. They should have said, look, you have to give us a deal that treats everyone well. Even if it's going to cost me a little bit of money, it'll be better for everyone. Instead, the venture capitalists said, yep, we love that deal. Like, here's my pocket, fill it up with cash. And for the minority investors, sucks to be you.
When we contemplate the spectacular explosions of WeWork and Theranos, what would it take to prevent another failure of that scale?
I don't think that WeWork and Theranos should have been regulated away, right? Like, I don't think that more regulations would have prevented WeWork and Theranos. I think in some respects, the system is working, but it's not working to the full extent. Like, look, Elizabeth Holmes created a fraud. She got people who invest in that fraud. The people who invested lost all their money, and she's on trial to go to jail. So it seems like that system is kind of working. Now, there were a lot of other people who were injured unfairly, right? There's people who got bad test results. There's people who were impacted by her fraud, and they deserve to be compensated. She deserves to be punished for that. But the system is trying to do that, right? We're always going to have frauds. And it's good that the people who invested lost all of their money. They should also be publicly ashamed for doing it. In the case of WeWork, there's other victims, right? Unfair victims, the employees of WeWork. But again, many of the people who invested money lost a lot of their money. Now, some venture capitalists who invested in WeWork, in fact, a number of venture capitalists who invested in WeWork, still got rich off of it. They still made big profits. And I think that there should be opportunities for the minority shareholders and for others to sue and say to venture capitalists, you should have been a better job of being the adult in the room. You should have been there making sure that things didn't go off the rails. That was your obligation. And I lost money because you didn't live up to your obligation. And I think that you should have to compensate me for that. I think that that's fair. And so I think that there are ways that we could strengthen civil liabilities and civil law to allow shareholders to sue. I think that regulators, government regulators, should be taking more of an interest in working harder to regulate companies where the board of directors does not seem to be living up to their responsibilities and does not seem to be doing a good job of keeping their eye on the firm. But these rules all exist. Like, we don't need new regulations to do this. We just need regulators that are willing to do it.
But what would that look like if regulators are doing it? What would it mean for regulators and prosecutors to get tougher on venture capitalists?
So there is a feeling among some of the observers of Silicon Valley that we need to see more criminal prosecutions of directors on boards for not upholding their fiduciary duty. And one person I was talking to, he said, look, the first time that you see a venture capitalist be put into handcuffs and put into the police car and prosecuted criminally for not being the adult in the room, for not living up to their obligation to protect minority shareholders, to stop a crazy CEO from doing crazy things, the first time one of those guys gets arrested and it's on TV, you're going to see a huge change in Silicon Valley. You're going to see a huge change across venture capitalists. And I think that's right? For a long time, regulators have been toothless when it comes to regulating private investments, in particular venture capitalists. There's been this romance about venture capitalists, that they're the handmaidens of innovation. And I think at some point, some regulator is going to step up and say, actually, these guys, this is where the buck stops. They didn't do their job. Let's haul them into court. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of other people are going to start saying, I got to pay closer attention and make sure that I don't get arrested next.
Charles Duhigg, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me on.
That was my conversation with Charles Duhigg, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of The Power of Habit. From Wondery, this is episode 4 of Theranos from American Scandal. In our next series, we look at one of the greatest heists in the history of the American West. In the early 1900s, Los Angeles was booming as Americans flocked to a paradise where the sun always shone bright. But the desert city was quickly running out of water, so local leaders hatched a plan to steal the precious resource from their neighbors in the north. It was a scheme that could save the city, even if it meant starting an armed conflict. American Scandal is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Music by Lindsey Graham. Our senior producer is Gabe Riven. Executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.